How and why did Netflix choose Lauren Schmidt-Hissrich as the showrunner for the Witcher TV show? Because initially, she turned down the job when it was offered to her. Yeah, initially she refused to take on the role of showrunner because she doesn't like fantasy.
I was a fan of The Last Wish, which was the only book that I had read at the time that Netflix approached me. And so I read it, I enjoyed it. Netflix came to me, about a year later and said, have you ever thought about adapting this? I said, nope.
And I commend her for being self-aware enough to know she was not the right person to adapt the source material.
Netflix came to me and asked me if I'd want to adapt it. I said no. That I was a huge fan, but I didn't think I was the right person to adapt a fantasy show.
I do think it's a writer's responsibility to look at the property as a whole, to look at, in this case, a really passionate existing fan base, whether it be from the books or the video games. And I think the writer has a responsibility to those people. And so I was thinking, I've never written fantasy before. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to honor this material.
But eventually she gave in, as Netflix insisted they wanted her and gave her free rein to tell the story she wanted. She's told us as much.
And I'm so grateful. The executive at Netflix is a woman named Kelly Luganville, who still I work incredibly closely with. But she said, dig back in and just, don't be bothered by your preconceptions of what a fantasy show should be. Tell us what you would do, like what your version of this would be.
As she puts it, and Netflix, and I love them for this, they sort of pushed back and said, don't worry about the fans. Remember, tell us the story that you want to tell.
Daredevil was my first show with Netflix, so that was exciting because they're such great creative partners and really allow people like me to have a lot of creative freedom in what I do.
And then later on ads, the constraints were still about delivering the best story. Even though I could say anything that I wanted, see anything that I wanted to see, do anything that I wanted to do, it doesn't mean that I have to do all those things. What I want to do is tell a good story. And this makes a mind-numbingly stupid truth about this show obvious. It was never meant to be an adaptation.
I love that. Again, it's like taking what we know from The Witcher and getting to slightly reinvent it.
Just looking at the team, most of them had never read the books before starting to work on it. At best, they'd played Witcher 3.
There's a few writers in the room who are complete gamers, who didn't even know that The Witcher was books. They only knew the game. Then I have people who had never heard of The Witcher before.
No, all this ever was meant to be was content for Netflix, using a popular IP. Make no mistake, the show only got greenlit because the games became a worldwide phenomenon.
In fact, the last time I was here, Donald gave me a gift. The video game developed here in Poland that's won fans the world over, The Witcher.
It wasn't really a passion project for anyone involved. Baginski, the one person who cared, was sidelined for not being part of the Hollywood machine. Netflix gave Hissrich free rein to tell whatever story she wanted to tell, as long as it could manage to rein in a pre-established audience by bearing the name Witcher. And when you look at how the show has been structured, they really haven't been trying to hide it. It's no coincidence that the most developed part of the writing is Yennefer's section of the show. It's the part that includes the most world building, the most politics, the most social commentary, and the most character development. This was the part of the show the team clearly took the most enjoyment bringing to life, because it was the stuff that is almost entirely original to the show, and at best, based on selected lines or vague remarks from the books.
I just really went back to the source material. I sort of paid attention to what Andrew had said when he was writing the books, what he left out, what we could have fun with. With comic books, I think it's great because there's a real economy of language, so you have to kind of fill in the gaps. And with The Witcher, there's 8 books. There's not a lot of gaps that need to be filled.
So what we did is we went through the books and we found all of the places where Andrew had talked about these characters' pasts. And then we wove those things together into a sort of new story for both Ciri and for Yennefer to make sure that we're really digging into their backgrounds. What excited me the most when I went to pitch Netflix is telling the story of Geralt the Witcher, but also telling the stories of Ciri and Yennefer, who are big players in the books, but aren't quite given the same introduction as Geralt. We're calling these in our series something called conduit moments. So this is just something that we came up with to sort of explore how these young women and men learned that they had magical powers.
The stuff that has the least source material to work with. This was the part they cared about. They cast Yennefer before they ever cast Geralt or Ciri.
Anya was actually the first person that we cast.
As they prioritized finding an actor who could play a younger, more naive version of Yennefer for the sake of a new backstory they wrote for her.
It was so important to get a character, or an actress rather, who could really go through the transformation that was needed, could really play a young girl who physically had the chops to be able to play with the disfigurement that Yennefer has. and then to go through the transformation into an incredibly powerful figure.
They've even said they cast Geralt based on who had chemistry with Anya Charlotra rather than the opposite, which is some pretty bonkers priorities when you think about how she has the least time dedicated to her in the source material, and this series is called The Witcher. Even when auditioning for Ciri, they prioritized having Freya Allan read for a scene with Dara, a character created by Hissrich.
We'll actually see in the next clip, I believe, the scene that you auditioned to. With a character named Dara.
This series was the showrunner's opportunity to write her own original story by filling in blanks in Sapkowski's lore and adding her creations to the mix.
It's wonderful and terrifying at the same time because you want to pay homage to the books and the lore, but also you want to create a whole story that exists that will be worthy of a Sapkowski book.
It's why they introduced a pointless monolith plotline that justifies the appearance of mutated monsters, so that they don't have to limit themselves to the ones Sapkowski employed, instead inventing whatever grotesque thing they wanted.
The monsters we meet are all fresh creations, but in true Andrzej Sapkowski fashion, they all sort of have their origins in European folktales. And
even beyond the main show, they keep making prequel spin-offs so that they can invent stuff.
And getting to build that world and explain how everything came to be with The Witcher, that's like a golden opportunity.
They give their takes on the fall of Kaer Morhen and the conjunction of the sphere, which were never tackled in the books, giving them huge leeway to invent new content. In fact, they have justified the existence of the Blood Origin spin-off as them trying to make sense of all the nonsensical lore they invented for the show. This thing is literally them trying to make sense of changes they made. As showrunner Declan DeBarra explains, I was working on The Witcher Season 2 and we had a story point we couldn't fix because we needed to know what happened. But the books never felt the need to explain that. You see how crazy this is? They added stuff to the source material to make the story their own, and that just dogpiles into a load of crap, low-effort spin-offs attempting to justify their changes. If this was an honest adaptation of the source material, they wouldn't feel the need to do this, because guess what? Sapkowski didn't. But no, instead they hide behind the thin veil of the books never explored these parts of the lore, so we want to answer questions, when really, no one, not even the original author, cared about those answers. It all ties back to the same idea. They feel limited by the source material.
You know, I wanted the world to feel very different than the world of The Witcher.
It was a chance to really explore the depths of something that was happening behind the curtains in the Witcher world.
And then I get to tell the story. So getting to flip that and, you know, you're still sending threads forward to the books with the characters and everything like that, but project a world that surprises the viewers. That was just very intriguing to me, you know.
It's very much important to Declan and myself and to Lauren to give the world of Blood Origin its own unique identity.
You clearly have a love for expanding on the Witcher universe, both in Season 2, in Nightmare of the Wolf anime.
And when you understand that, it explains a lot about the show's writing. The show is at its very core a compromise between producers who want to attract an audience through a popular franchise in an effort to turn a profit, and writers who wish to express themselves and have no attachment to said franchise. And hey, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Compromise can be a source for creative expression. This conflict could absolutely have been drawn on to create a new take on the series that could stand on its own. I'll even repeat what I said throughout this essay. I can actually see why Hissrich made some of the storytelling decisions she made, and in fact really like her pitch for the series. I like the idea of having Ciri be the drumbeat at the heart of the show. Hell, I generally prefer Freya Allan's performance to Joe Wyatt's. I like introducing Yennefer early on to better understand her perspective and why Ciri will matter so much to her. I like how Jaskir's songs and the storytelling potential of music are felt all throughout the show, giving a true sense this is a retelling of an old tale. I like how each episode has an icon that eventually is reforged into the logo of the show to represent the characters united. I don't even mind having Geralt's episodic storylines, building him into the caring and empathetic figure we know and love, as the show reworks his journey from the books into an origin story of sorts. Any of these ideas could have formed the basis for a solid show, but there is a world of difference between a few separate ideas and a fully produced show.
I know perfectly well, being an old guy and the that you cannot judge the soup buy the groceries, you know?
That's what I hold against the writers. The fact that even when given such creative freedom, they still made a poorly written, uninspired show. The team's ambitions never went beyond the bare minimum. They sanded down every interesting aspect of The Witcher for the sake of doing their own thing, and still only created a mediocre, run-of-the-mill fantasy show. And given the background of the team, it's not surprising. While I don't think you need to like fantasy to write The Witcher, I do firmly believe you need to understand the genre. You still need to care enough to learn the tropes. The franchise is based heavily on subversion of expectations, on playing with the cliches of the genre and flipping them on their head. As Sapkowski puts it, I did it as a part of a long war with the fantasy stereotype, with the banality of the final duel in the Black Citadel. So to convey that subversive nature of the books, you need to understand the appeal of the genre and know what the typical pitfalls are. And I don't think Hissrich and her team do. Compare that Sapkowski quote to this statement by Haley Hall. The Witcher is a fantasy show a la Game of Thrones, about a monster hunter, a sorceress, and a girl who holds the power inside her to bring about the apocalypse. If you compare these separate views on the series, and honestly believe that Netflix's writers remotely understand the intent of the original author, I don't think I'll ever be able to convince you otherwise. Hissrich and her team seemingly have the most surface-level understanding of the fantasy genre, and as a result have the most surface-level understanding of the Witcher franchise. Hissrich seems to think fantasy is nothing more than imaginary creatures, magic, and epic battles.
I think fantasy a lot of times is really, really earnest. It's about big sort of life-changing stuff, battles and wars being fought and, people being marginalized. And fantasy, because it deals with big themes and war and death, it's a very earnest medium in general. Fantasy can be really earnest at times because it does deal with such big themes, politics and family and battles, and so it has a tendency to always be very dramatic.
And I think what's interesting about that logline is it doesn't mention magic or monsters or sword fights or, any really of the hallmarks that I think people would say like, oh, that means it's The Witcher.
When in interviews she discusses how a focus on the supernatural are what separates Witcher from other series in the genre, I can't help but scratch my head. Sure, they're important to Witcher, but also to a lot of fantasy. It seems like Mrs. Hissrich has barely read or watched anything in the genre outside of HBO's Game of Thrones and Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, but it really just shows how limited her understanding of the genre as a whole is. She goes on to claim that the show's exploration of how magic works in their world is what distinguishes the show from others, but that rings hollow, and clearly the actors had no clue what they were doing on set.
When we started filming, shooting, it says, and Mousak conjures a war or conjures something up, and you stand with your director and Lauren Hissrich, the showrunner. You say, okay, this is how I think Mousak should bring the energy into the room, and what do you think?
The rules of magic are just this generic idea of everything has a cost, but it never really delves deeper than that, as why some spells are easy and others difficult just bend to the convenience of what the writers need for the plot. This certainly is no Full Metal Alchemist, so honestly, if that's supposed to be what makes this show special, it's kinda sad. The show really never tackles the supernatural beyond, ooh, look, a monster, and magic is difficult. There's no actual delving into the occult, into the unexplainable and the horrifying, which is not surprising when Hissrich has also admitted to being too squeamish to enjoy horror as a genre. And another thing she brings up often in interviews is the humor of the show.
What I love about how real people exist is, in the face of tragedy, we often turn to humor. It's our only way to keep going. And the characters do that all the time in The Witcher. And The Witcher has those moments, but is also incredibly funny. Because The Witcher isn't just about the important special people in the world, it's about everyone else as well.
But that rings hollow when she seemingly only realized halfway through production that the show should be funny.
I, from the beginning, thought, okay, here's the style of the show. Yes, The Witcher is a bit funny, but it's going to look like a serious, fantasy show. And then very quickly, on our feet, we realized that wasn't working. It needed a pace in it that really, and again, this was really informed by the humor that started coming out when we were shooting, and the chemistry between characters. So much more rose to the surface.
Which again, just shows how narrow her understanding of the fantasy genre is. Fantasy is an inherently ridiculous genre that's often not afraid to poke fun at itself. Have you never heard of The Hobbit, Narnia, Princess Bride, Terry Pratchett?
And there were so many outrageous things done in the name of fantasy, so many silly films that I thought, it's time to have a laugh at it.
Have you ever played through a D&D campaign? While I love the humor of the Witcher books, I would not say that's what makes it unique. It's the voice of the characters that gives the book that edge. I legitimately don't understand how you can be the lead writer on a show that's supposed to deconstruct the fantasy genre, but not understand what that genre offers in the first place. Do you honestly believe Sergio Leone would have managed to deconstruct the Western so thoroughly with his Dollars trilogy had he not grown up watching American Westerns? Of course not. Subversive works like these require a basic understanding of their respective source materials to twist cliches and toy with audience expectations. When you're familiar with the style, you can more easily bring to light new ways to look at it, reinvent it, and elevate it. But the writing team clearly lacked that comprehensive overview of the fantasy genre to achieve that. Instead, they gave us what they knew how to write, a superhero show. Sure, it's in a fantasy setting, but it has all the tropes of that genre. Why else do you think they need to give us the Nilfgaardians as faceless, mindless religious zealots in Season 1, or a goddamn omnipotent witch in Season 2? Because you need a big bad for the heroes to fight at the end, someone for the Avengers, the Witchers, to assemble against.
We call it the Monster Mash, which is sort of the epic big battle in the finale. I would say that it is one of sort of the most brutal fights that we've seen, one of the biggest, because it obviously involves all of the Witchers that are at Kaer Morhen. It involves Geralt, it involves Yennefer, it involves Ciri, Jaskir's there, Vesemir's there. It is basically an all-hands-on-deck battle, and it's pretty epic.
The show is a fantasy horror action show written by people who might appreciate action, but don't understand the appeal of fantasy or horror, and they don't even seem to be trying to understand.
When people ask me to describe it, I'm like, well, it's an adventure, but also romance, and there's some monsters, so it's a little bit horror now and then, and it's an epic, heroic tale. It's a little bit of everything.
But whatever your thoughts are, that's my opinion too.
I mean, hell, they're not even trying to hide the fact that they don't understand the books. When asked about her interpretation of Geralt compared to the more eloquent book version, her answer was this. I also don't know why it works so well in the books, because every bit of logic tells you that if given the choice between following the journey of an active character or a passive character, active is going to be more interesting. This is where the show falls apart. Hissrich and her team seemingly never even took the time to try and understand Sapkowski's character. They seem to only have a surface level understanding of the original text, often taking things at face value when the author was purposefully playing with tropes to convey his much more complex vision of the genre. The whole issue of how the show treats destiny stems from this, where Sapkowski showed the concept of destined for greatness was ridiculous, using a common trope of the genre only to flip it on its head.
Do you believe in destiny, Dandelion? Well, yes. But did you know that destiny alone is not enough? That something more is necessary? I don't understand. You're not the only one, but that's how it is. Something more is needed.
Hissrich just uses destiny as the driving force of her saga.
People linked by destiny will always find each other.
It completely ruins the Ciri-Geralt dynamic, as the intimacy of their relationship is lost to the convenience of prophecy. The show appears unaware that the books completely scoffed at the fantasy trope and instead made it its central focus.
This is Geralt's sort of first run-in with destiny in the show, and it really changes his journey for the entire rest of the season.
In fact, the way Hissrich's team is trying to frame Ciri's narrative as a positive and relatable coming-of-age story really shows the degree to which they are Flanderizing the book's subversive approach to destiny by giving us a run-of-the-mill hero's journey instead.
The typical conforming life of a princess, she wants to kind of break free from that.
As Hissrich puts it, I think Ciri's journey in Season 2 is so compelling and so relatable for so many different people. For teenagers who are growing up and starting to reach out into their independence. For women who want to take back power and be okay walking through the world. They have literally framed her story as that of a chosen hero destined to make right the wrongs of the past, stating bluntly that she must avenge her ancestors of Falca and Lara Dorn. To which I must say, you missed the whole point of the character. Her entire storyline in the books was to show the flaws of the chosen hero archetype, not celebrate it. Ciri started her journey wanting to learn to fight, use magic, and generally become a hero. As she learned more about her powers, she grew increasingly cocky until life brought that all crashing down. Because of something she had no control over, Ciri is abused, winds up disfigured, and with such crippling PTSD that she becomes a spiteful nihilist that turns to violence as a means to cope with her trauma. Like Sapkowski put it, I planned Ciri as a monster. I wanted to show show how people make a human into a monster. The point of her story was to show how toxic and damaging this idea of the chosen hero is, as her magical lineage caused her nothing but pain for very little gain. Hell, the author hammered this further by stating her child was the child of prophecy, not her, and then further revealing the horrible disaster they were prophesied to stop was just climate change that happened millennia after Ciri's birth.
The civilization of the Northern Hemisphere is doomed to extinction. It will vanish beneath the ice of a spreading glacier, beneath permanent pack ice and snow. There's no need to panic, though, because it'll take some time before it happens. How much time do we have? A good deal. How much, Nimu? Some 3,000 years.
Ciri's life was ruined over something she couldn't realistically face. Sapkowski made it obvious that chosen heroes are pretty much pointless and do more harm than good. It's why at the end of the series, Ciri refused to accomplish her chosen role. She didn't fulfill her destiny and instead left her world for another to forge her own path. The very last line of the whole series was,
"That was all behind them, and before them was everything."
Because that was the whole point, to outgrow this belief that we somehow have a higher purpose, this lofty dream that we are somehow special. That doesn't mean her story wasn't a coming-of-age one, but that growth came from realizing that there are no such thing as chosen heroes, and that the only way to accept oneself is to abandon such lofty beliefs. But Netflix's writers don't care. Their writing is only interested in showing a woman discover the power that existed within her all along, that gives her all the means to fix the world.
Through Ciri's powers, she starts looking into the person that she wants to be in the future, not just the person that she was in the past.
They came for me.
Well then, they got what they deserved.
When you have power like this, never apologize.
Her entire journey has been focused on her finding out what she really is, on figuring out how to control it.
In this episode, the big thing for Ciri is an escalation in her powers. Ciri's got some real powers that we haven't even begun to touch on.
Why we thought that this season was right for the Wild Hunt is that we're starting to delve into Ciri's powers a little bit more. In fact, that's Geralt's main thrust in this season.
But also, again, we're putting Ciri in this place of, who am I? What kind of monster am I? Am I like my grandmother? Now I just kill people.
And part of that investigation for him is into her powers. What are they? What do they access? And sort of what are the ripples that they're going to cause through the continent?
It's just the same thing every season because they've removed the subversive aspects of her story, instead boiling down this character to the trope she embodied. Rather than a multi-layered and complex deconstruction of the failures of an archetype, the writers reduced her to the cliché of the naive hero whose mysterious past is suddenly revealed by a dying relative and forces her to find a mentor to learn to hone it in.
All she's known was a sheltered life as a princess and this very secure network of people looking after her.
As Freya Allen puts it, it was interesting to explore her powers, see her navigate the truth of her past that's been totally hidden from her for her whole life. But none of that was hidden in the books.
You knew who I was from the very beginning, didn't you? Not from the beginning. You lifted the curse from my daddy, didn't you? Well, that's not true, he said, shaking his head. Your mama did. And your grandmama. I only helped.
They've emphasized the mystery of her backstory, and the end result is who Ciri is barely matters in all of this. All that is important to the show is that she is ready to use her powers for the greater good when the time comes, so that she can finally fulfill the role her ancestors set up for her.
Here's your destiny. If that's the last words that her grandmother said to her, it means a great deal, and I think that's what keeps her determined to continue on. I'm just tired, Geralt.
I'm tired too, Ciri. But what of it? What is destined cannot be avoided.
And it's obvious with how they already have Ciri opening portals left and right despite having zero training. Everywhere they focused on her lineage, on how she's meant for greater things, even creating prequels to show how awesome her ancestors were and how she must live up to their legacy.
Ayla's pregnant at the end. And we know that that's part of Ithleen's prophecy, that there is a seed in her that will eventually lead to someone who's important in the Witcher world.
She's now pregnant with his child, which contains some of the bloodline and magic and biology and genetics of his transformation.
Ithleen's prophecy is all over the Witcher series, but it's often talked about as this kind of folkloric thing. And so even though we are told that we should believe it, it's like, well, if the people in the universe themselves don't believe it, why should I as a viewer or writer believe it? And how's it going to impact Ciri?
You're not supposed to believe Ithlinne's prophecy. It doesn't come to fruition as Ciri literally rejects it. The books never bothered to answer if she was related to Falca because it didn't matter, while Netflix instead confirmed it out of the gate. The focuses are completely different. Where the books looked at the character and how prophecies affected her on a personal scale, the show is only interested in how she plays her decided part in that larger plan.
It does mean a lot to her, but she doesn't quite know yet what it means.
In a way, Hissrich is doing the very thing the villains did in the books by dehumanizing Ciri to instead focus on her prophesized role, reducing her to nothing more than a plot point.
And what we wanted to do is make sure that by the end of the season, we understood just how many people are after this poor girl.
Like in the books, her blood is valuable to the Wild Hunt, Nilfgaard, and presumably Vilgefortz, but on top of that, the writers added they can also save the Dryads, the Witchers, and the Anshe Elves.
And Ciri to them represents a savior.
With a vial of your blood, we could protect generations to come.
He's saying she could save us.
Well, even monsters seem to have some kind of connection to her, as they reach out to her rather than try to kill her.
I think we're close.
Which again, and I can't emphasize this enough, misses the point. Ithlinne's prophecy is supposed to be a red herring, as it's revealed to be nothing more than a mistranslation by overly poetic humans of an elven scientific paper on climate change.
The time of the white cold and the wolfish snowstorm shall come. Poetry. Do you prefer it less poetic? As a result of a change in the angle of the sun's rays, the margin of permafrost will shift significantly.
The whole hullabaloo surrounding Ciri's powers was revealed to be ultimately really anticlimactic and not nearly as interesting as the prophecies made it out to be, because the character should be what matters. But Hissrich's team don't care. They want Ciri's story to be about her special abilities she has to learn to control thanks to her superpowered parental figures, to be about that larger plot, because those cliches have been popular in the past, I guess.
We needed to find someone who could portray both of those sides, portray a little more of the childlike naivete in the continent, but also grow to be someone who, well, can change the whole world by herself. So,
but as the series continues, much, much later, we're going to start to get into exactly what voice was speaking to her and what agenda that voice has. It's a mystery, actually, that we're going to keep building out throughout the series.
I mean, fuck, they cut her entire relationship to Geralt in Season 1 to emphasize that aspect of her arc.
I have to find my destiny.
Why? Because your grandmother said you should?
And look, the game also did this, unfortunately, but at least they captured her relationship to Geralt well. This show doesn't even have that. As their marketing so aptly puts it, she was created by prophecy and destined to fight. But Ciri is not Luke Skywalker, John Connor, or Harry Potter. She is a subversion of those characters. I'm sorry for repeating myself, but just like Yennefer and just like Geralt, they've reduced the character to the archetype she embodied with none of the depth or commentary to actually make the story worth telling. Even on a broader scale, the books played with the cliche of an evil empire. There, Nilfgaard was the aggressively expansionist invader, but the novels also made it entirely clear that from a bureaucratic and cultural standpoint, they were far and away ahead of the Northern Realms.
In all the historical and military literature, it became customary only to write the Battle of Brenna, both in the north and in Nilfgaardian sources, of which, nota bene, there are many more than ours.
Like the different empires they were based on, they were horrible people that employed slavery and hurt those they conquered, but you also couldn't deny the impact they had on the arts and general enlightenment. But in the show, they are essentially orcs, an endless barrage of monstrous barbarians that come from an uneducated land of religious zealotry that cannot be reasoned with and cannot be stopped.
Nilfgaard takes no prisoners.
Nilfgaard remains a shit rag of the south, and that's saying something.
It's like nobody knows where they've come from and how they've come there so quickly, because a lot of them are sort of like, fanatically kind of brainwashed into being this army.
In our other stories, Nilfgaard has been presented as this kind of one-dimensional evil empire that is set to take over the world.
And the little good that they do by offering civil services to their subjects is still framed as a negative.
They look out for their people. Everybody gets something.
The same thing, which tastes as if someone pissed in my cup.
Because of her lack of understanding of the genre, Hissrich completely missed the subversive nature of the books that gave them their moral ambiguity. As director Mark Jobst puts it when asked about how much research on the series he did, very little. We were clear that we wanted to show the work for all fantasy fans, not just Witcher fans. I approach directing all dramas the same way. What's the story? What are the stakes? Who do I care for and why should I care for them? And that's how I approached this. They are taking the story at face value, boiling it down to its ingredients, but not looking at the wider picture. And the end result is they are changing a multi-dimensional story into the typical fantasy tale where the underdog becomes the super powerful knight in shining armor. The showrunner read The Witcher, saw the cliches, but did not see why they were implemented.
We talked about shying away from this story, because dragons are something that have obviously been done in fantasy a lot.
Instead of using the tropes to toy with audience expectations, she created the most generic, hackneyed fantasy show out there, one that uses every single fantasy banality that was present in the novels, but without the commentary inherent to them. It's why she calls the Wild Hunt dark elves rather than, elves from another dimension.
That Volthmir is actually not just a demon, but she is a dark elf. She's part of the Wild Hunt.
Why destiny and prophecy is the be-all end-all of the show rather than a red herring. Why Geralt has to be an emotionless badass monster hunter rather than the anxious and caring intellectual he was in the books. They're not reinventing the fantasy genre, they're just reusing fantasy cliches without a hint of self-awareness, probably because they don't even realize the series was criticizing those tropes in the first place. And the funny thing is, through that loss of depth, the humor she said was so integral to the show was also lost. The books used knowledge of fairy tales to highlight the absurdity of many situations. Renfrey in the books was explicitly a twisted version of Snow White, down to her having a posse of 7 dwarves and almost getting poisoned by an apple. The Law of Surprise was a play on the tale of Rumpelstiltskins, and the Striga was a monstrous version of the story of Sleeping Beauty. The Witcher as a series is very much a cross between Shrek and Princess Bride, a crazy amalgam of different fairy tales mushed together into an incomprehensible mess that is inherently funny through its absurdity. This was only enhanced by our main protagonists, Geralt, Yen, and even Dandelion, who were all educated, modern, and almost anachronistic characters in this fantasy setting. They often had knowledge of fables and science that other characters lacked, which helped highlight the ridiculousness of the world they were in.
I think you're a fool. Yennefer once told me that the moon causes the tides. Dandelion cackled. What bloody rubbish! What does the moon have to do with the sea?
Ultimately, when reading the books, you always got the sense that Sapkowski loved and respected the fantasy stories he was pulling from, and wanted to see them elevated further by pointing out their flaws. This is down to him ending the series with Ciri entering into Arthurian legend, basically making the books his elaborate self-insert fanfic. But the show's interpretation of that humor is limited to Henry Cavill saying,
"Fuck."
That and talking about feces and gonads.
What happened with you motherfucker goat?
Coin to your Witcher, oh valley of penis.
You're a dick. With balls.
Oh, shit.
He was kicked in the balls by an ox as a child.
What? That's true.
What is this wretched business here?
They almost never play with the fantasy elements of the world to bring a sense of humor. There's no wit, no parody or playfulness to any of it. Instead, they substitute humor with profanity, and it cheapens not only the dialogue, but the drama.
Nice scars, shithead.
Firefucker.
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh,
And they're proud of it, too.
And you were like, I want my elves, they're gonna curse. They're gonna sound like everyone else in our world. And it was one of the big distinctions that I think you made from the get-go. And I love that. So Declan would run around set, Declan Devara, and run towards me and be like, change that line for this, I've just another idea.
What was that line?
There's one where I'm like, to you, I'm like, if you fell into a bucket full of stones, into a bucket full of tits, you'd come up holding a cock.
Like running on stage and coming up with jokes like that, that's just all part of it.
The show will never have a moment as hilarious as when Yennefer used magic to fling Geralt's bath into the street onto an unsuspecting passerby, or when Geralt had to serve as a marriage counselor to a mermaid and a nobleman, scenes that lovingly parodied famous myths and legends. The author was so familiar with the codes of the genre that he would play with them, which gave the book some of their most entertaining moments. But that is lost in this show due to the writer's lack of appreciation for the genre as a whole. All we got in its stead was cookie-cutter one-liners and funny sidekicks who spew jokes that would fit in any setting.
It's too late for that.
Geralt? Yennefer told me to
You're busy. You're busy. Yeah.
Again, the typical superhero formula in a fantasy setting. While Hissrich understood the books were funny, she seemingly didn't realize the humor in them stems specifically from that fantasy setting. The few moments that do play with the genre this way are the lines and episodes that stick the closest to the source material. Lines like this one.
Doesn't rhyme. All good predictions rhyme.
Or episodes like Bottled Appetite and A Grain of Truth. While I have my issues with how those episodes go, as the morals of the stories are completely lost in the adaptation, they remain for the most part a playful look at classic fairy tales with a postmodern twist. But episodes like these that trust in Sapkowski's sensibilities are few and far between. Everywhere else, the fantasy setting was used for one thing and one thing alone: action. Geralt fighting a monster, Ciri fighting a monster, Yennefer fighting a monster. This is the extent to which she uses the genre, to create spectacle.
I knew that we wanted to do some cool monsters. There's a lot of cool monsters in those pages.
But ultimately, just a group of badasses who kill monsters.
To me, the Fall of Kaer Morhen is exactly what we needed it to be. So you've got dozens of witchers, you have hundreds of monsters, and you have thousands of humans.
And then you have the joyous part where you get to go home as a writer by yourself outside the room and come up with cool shit. And monsters, it's like, this is the greatest thing, I get to write monsters.
It is jam-packed with
Yeah,
action and fight scenes and some, just beautiful movement.
It didn't make sense to have a lot of pauses in those stories. Declan had written, honestly, some beautiful scenes of people around campfires and sort of slowing down. But once we got into editorial, it was really, really clear that we needed to keep the momentum moving.
And this is in all likelihood because the genre and commenting on it never really interested Hissrich in the first place. Anything the fantasy genre could offer was second to what actually attracted her to this source material, that being the family dynamics between the core three characters.
And I have to say, it was this idea of found family that really got to me when I was telling you about that sort of initial log line. When I started to read it, I realized that, okay, I'm not sure that I'm ever going to be the best person to bring a huge epic fantasy to life. But if you boil the fantasy down and see it as a family story that then has amazing, fantastical world around it, well, that's a story that I know I can dig into with my soul.
And yeah, it is an important aspect of the books, but with all due respect, after 2 seasons, where is that dynamic? How much time have Geralt, Ciri, and Yennefer shared together? How much of that time has been spent building their relationship, and how much has just been mindless action and worthless spin-offs that somehow managed to undermine their bond further by having their entire life story determined millennia in advance by prophecy?
Przepychać jakby granice tego, co jest możliwe do opowiedzenia. Będziemy zwiększać skalę, że będziemy zwiększać zasięg tego i oby widzowie jakby odpowiedzieli, nie? Czyli to też bardzo wiele zależy od dynamiki widowni, czyli jeżeli widzom się spodoba to, co robimy, no to będziemy mieli coraz więcej wolności i będziemy mogli podkręcać i skalę, i rozmach.
The moment you made it so Geralt and Ciri were forced together by destiny rather than them wanting to be together, you butchered their relationship. The second you had Ciri and Geralt be strangers that need to learn and trust each other over time, you undermined their story. Witcher is supposed to surprise us, as it reveals itself to be more than just a fantasy book about a cool monster hunter destined to defend a princess, but instead reveals itself as this loving reimagining of the genre as a whole, showing that scary guy on the cover is actually a sweet guy worried for his daughter.
Asked to choose my reward, I invoked the law of surprise. Never thought I'd actually meet the child promised to me at that time, but already I felt bound to her.
By destiny.
By something more.
But with this show, the character dynamics are wrong because the subversion of fantasy tropes was never a part of the show's DNA. Netflix just gave us the trope of the naive chosen one and her gruff protector. There may be some familial bond that will form someday in season 3 or 4, but the basis of it will always be iffy at best, rooted in the convenience of prophecy rather than the humanity of its characters. They are leaning into cliches that got old a decade ago and have been done better elsewhere rather than injecting anything unique into the relationship. The fact that Hissrich seems proud that she made Geralt and Ciri's relationship that of father and daughter is just an indication of her shallow understanding of the books.
And we went back and forth on the show about whether the tone was more older brother or more father figure. But I have to say, I leaned personally toward father figure.
That's no big reveal. That was the text. That was literally the whole point.
And a girl, your daughter? Aye. Geralt squeezed Ciri's hand again.
It's not some secret subtext that you have uncovered. Stop acting like it is.
Honestly, I think that's why I got the show, is because I was willing to sort of see the deeper layers that were there and not just sort of the fun fantasy stuff.
You are not some brilliant artist for understanding what was there, black on white on the page. At best, you just revealed how little care you've put into understanding the books. At worst, it makes it seem like you're attempting to undermine the source material in the eyes of the public by making it seem like you somehow elevated it, when in reality you are just passing the original author's ideas as your own. The betrayal of dynamics is the same with the Geralt and Yennefer relationship. The few intimate moments they have see Geralt falling asleep mid-conversation, which makes Yennefer come off more as stress relief than anything else.
Do I bore you?
Not at all. You're important to me.
Beyond that, Geralt knows nothing of Yennefer's past trauma, and she resents him for it.
I thought your transformation healed all parts of you.
At the cost of losing others, yes.
And seriously, you, a mother?
Do you think I'd make a bad one?
Definitely.
They are on completely different wavelengths. This is in stark opposition to the books that had Geralt using his Witcher senses to perceive who she really was, and Yennefer using magic to read his mind to understand him, as both grew frustrated at the other's inability to actually talk directly and openly about these things.
I love you, Yen. You used only to think it. But today you said it. Is there such a difference? A huge one.
Stop reading my mind.
Something to hide?
Don't like secrets?
No.
This is where the tension lied. They both understood each other and knew the other loved them, but neither was confident in themselves to say it candidly. That underlying understanding is not present in the show. Really, their relationship here can be summed up by this. A magic kiss that transfers more power to Geralt. Instead of two scared individuals trying to figure out how to let themselves be vulnerable, we got two alpha fuck buddies who compete to be the top in their relationship. After 2 seasons, they've never spent more than one night together at a time, which reduces them to nothing more than vessels for sexual tension. So many of the stories that explored their bond, from Shard of Ice to A Little Sacrifice to something more, have all been cut, reducing their relationship to a goddamn montage. The book subverted the idea of true love by showing Geralt and Yennefer genuinely cared for each other, but then adding that it isn't that simple. True love can still be complicated and require work. Meanwhile, the show has happily settled on the idea that opposites attract without ever delving deeper than that.
They are really, really opposite in everything. They're both really strong characters, but they're each on their own journey and have no desire to have any connection to people whatsoever. And I think that's actually kind of what draws them together in the end.
There's never any exploration of how and why Yennefer changed Geralt, just that it was always meant to be, and so she did, relying on the magical convenience of love at first sight.
And basically it's one of those can't live with you, can't live without you situations.
This is particularly obvious when you realize the writers gave them constant sex scenes to make up for their weak chemistry. As Anya Charlotte puts it, I think initially it's just this animalistic, lustful relationship. Yennefer finds herself drawn to him, it's magnetic, and she doesn't want to need anyone, but she needs him. This is to the point that the writers originally intended them to bang upon being reunited in Season 2, to which Cavill and Charlotte had to refuse and insist the scene be rewritten to be more sentimental. And the ensuing conversation just winds up being awkward since they have very little chemistry.
What changed your mind about claiming the girl? You seemed so certain it was a mistake back then.
Many things change my mind. You among them.
I ran into Yaskia.
The writers have reduced their relationship to a sexual one rather than an emotional one, given audiences what Hollywood media has given them for decades at the expense of everything that made these characters and their bond special. As for Ciri and Yennefer, I mean, come on. Their relationship after 2 seasons boils down to, hey, I kidnapped you, almost sacrificed you, but I changed my mind once I was caught red-handed, so we're family, right? There is nothing there, and it sucks. How many mother-daughter relationships are in fantasy? Very few. Most of the time the mom dies at childbirth, so Netflix could have just given us something new by simply developing that. But instead, they butchered it by giving them no screen time together. They have Ciri care because of dreams that tell her she should care.
I dreamed about you once. before I even knew you existed.
Dreams are powerful omens. Perhaps we were meant to find each other.
And then what little is there is poisoned anyways by having Yennefer's plot to sacrifice her.
She's constantly got this idea of like lying and lack of trust, and so I think it is a big blow when Yennefer does that. It's like another example of why I can't trust anyone except Geralt at this point, you know?
Which shows such a misunderstanding of these characters, it's shocking. The beauty of the franchise was that in this morally gray world where you can never be sure of anything, the one thing you could always count on was that Geralt and Yen's love for Ciri was unconditional. Never, not once did you question if they had her best interest in mind. It was one of the rare absolute truths of these stories, and it highlighted how special this family was. But the showrunners immediately put that in question by having the first thing Yennefer do upon meeting Ciri is betray her, for no other reason than it makes for cheap drama.
And then she has to choose between love and her selfish desire, or rather desperation to get her powers back. And she's never kind of hesitated before now to kind of get what she wants. And then when she's with Ciri, she just wants to save her.
They can frame it now as she must earn their trust, but no matter what happens, that betrayal will always be in the back of our minds. We'll always have to question Yennefer's intent, and it taints the entire dynamic of this family.
When Geralt comes to them in that scene, sort of implicates that he has to kill a monster, and we played with the idea that she's wondering, is he going to kill Yennefer?
Even Netflix's marketing team agrees, apparently. Their own licensed products don't even print Yennefer on t-shirts supposed to be putting forward this family, instead replacing her with Jaskier, which is honestly hilarious. Because they focus so much on Geralt and Ciri's bond through prophecy, and Geralt and Yennefer's bond through magic, Yennefer and Ciri's bond will always feel less important. In the books this wasn't a problem, as all three bonds put the human aspects first, but in the show, they've emphasized the supernatural elements. But Yennefer and Ciri don't have that extra push, so this connection will always inherently be lesser than the other two, no matter what the writers want us to believe. At the end of the day, Charlotta and Freya Allan were always going to be fighting an uphill battle to convince us there was some form of mother-daughter relationship between the two of them, when they only have 5 years age difference. I cannot wrap my head around why the production team thought it would be a good idea to cast actors so similar in age that it's impossible to see Yennefer as something other than an older sister. And I'd also argue that the 14 years difference is probably not helping the chemistry between Cavill and Charlotta either, but who knows, they're actors. Maybe with a better script it could have worked. I'm just saying Geralt has better chemistry with Renfri than he does with the supposed love of his life.
And we see these two people fall in love, frankly, and it's very fast and it's very messy. It does not have a good ending.
As does Yennefer with both Istrid and Jaskier, and in all three of those couples, the age gap is reduced by quite a bit. Coincidence? Maybe, but it's worth thinking about. And with how rushed the casting process was, the actors never actually read together. So it's not surprising the chemistry of this family is never all that great, since those behind the project never took the time to, check if the three worked as a unit. And with the recasting of Geralt, what little bond that was formed is going to evaporate anyways, as the changes in actors will certainly transform the dynamics. So yeah, so much for the central theme of family Hissrich claims attracted her to the project. When you take a step back and look at the story she's told, it becomes obvious all these characters have toxic relationships they are forced to stick through due to circumstance, rather than any desire to be together, making what was once a caring family into a dysfunctional one.
That's part of the fun, is to take these characters who understand that they're each other's destiny, not really embracing it, but accepting that this is what they need to do to continue walking through the continent. And then see, what would that really be like? What would it be like for two strangers to come together and feel like that's what they've been driving for the entire season? They finally got together, and then they're like, oh, I don't know you at all. You are a stranger.
In fact, this trend of making any genuine bond Ciri had in the source material dishonest or destructive in some way can be seen in every single relationship. Calanthe has gone from being a fair if firm ruler to someone Ciri learns was barbarically exterminating elves.
My grandmama says that dryads aren't evil, and my grandmama is the wisest woman in the world. My grandmama says there should be more forests like this one.
And we hear about how sort of vicious Calanthe was. And there's something in this moment when Ciri picks up a knife and is ready to kill someone, that we start to see that Ciri actually has inherited some traits from her grandmother.
Triss has gone from calling Ciri her little sister to being terrified of her.
Something wants to take possession of her, something which is too powerful for me. I am afraid for her.
No!
destroy us all.
Vesemir has gone from being a kind grandpa figure to someone who is willing to sacrifice her in order to create more Witchers.
We had such a fright, Vesemir admitted and sighed. Oh, that we did, child. More than we could take.
Ciri has to be eliminated. Daughter a demon. She has done too much damage.
The Witchers expect her to prove herself, as opposed to unquestioningly embracing her as Geralt's daughter and one of their own.
He fell silent and looked at Ciri, who, with a joyful squeal, acknowledged that she had the upper hand in the game. Triss spied a small smile on Cohen's face and was sure he had allowed her to win.
It's really incredible, and it's where, in our story, she proves her grit to the rest of the Witchers. When she first arrives into their world, they're really suspicious of her and make fun of her, kind of like big brothers, but just think that she shouldn't be there. She doesn't belong there. And that's the sequence where she actually earns a lot of respect.
The Skelligan Isles, which were like a second home to her in the source material, are now indifferent to her misery and would exploit her for political gain.
If your intention to go to Ciri's aid is genuine and heartfelt, and I presume it is, I have no choice. I must help you with your scheme.
What about Skellig? I have people there too. I'd be safe there.
If you want. But you'd be married off to the nearest Lord of Bad Breath.
And you may be asking yourself, why would the writers do this? Why would they decide to make her social sphere this shitty environment that has all the makings of a self-destructive family? Seriously, the characters do the worst things to each other and then promptly apologize as if it makes it all better. They claim to love each other like nothing ever happened, which is textbook emotional abusive behavior.
We were in trouble and needed help, and you betrayed us.
As if I'd trust anyone else with her.
I believe in you.
This way.
I'm sorry for what I did.
Well, the reason they do this is because it makes it easier to introduce conflict into the plot.
But of course, this provides a great deal of conflict between her and Geralt.
How do you feel like they feel about each other at the end of the season?
I don't know.
It's
tricky.
It's a tricky one. I mean, it's a fairly extreme set of circumstances to come back from.
When you have all these characters that don't get along but keep getting stuck together due to forces outside of their control, of course drama is going to ensue. It makes it so much easier to introduce a dramatic cliffhanger when the characters can never be happy around each other.
When we're editing The Witcher, for instance, we're always thinking about how do we make the story feel satisfactory at the end while still leaving just that tiny little thing that you're like, oh, okay, 5 seconds, I'm just going to let you roll into the next episode.
Więc musieliśmy wytworzyć troszeczkę więcej takich zwrotów akcji, trochę więcej momentów, które pozwalają zbudować tego typu kulminacje.
In fact, this mentality is obvious given the justification Hissrich gave for killing Escoloff in Season 2.
The very first version of the script we wrote was a brand new Witcher that we'd never met before, we'd never heard of, and all of a sudden we were like, oh, our audience is going to meet Cohen and Lambert and Eskel and, John. Who's going to die? John is going to die.
Her goal in targeting a fairly popular yet minor character was to instill shock in audiences. Really, they are trying to be clever by subverting the expectations of audiences with unpredictable twists and turns.
So we have fans and we want them to feel honored, but we also want to surprise and excite them.
But they are missing the fact that the source material was already inherently subversive. When you attempt to subvert the subversive, guess what? You just wrap back around to cliché, reducing this show to a hollow collection of shallow overused fantasy tropes.
Well, we knew we had to kill someone in that episode. We knew that we wanted a monster to enter Kaer Morhen and have something to do with Ciri.
Hissrich failed to understand the most obvious thing. She didn't need to kill anyone. You could have Kaer Morhen be a peaceful place where no one dies, like in the source material. That's the whole point of it. This time shared between Geralt, Ciri, Yennefer, and the rest of the supporting cast is the good times. It's the happy moments that motivate everyone to want to be reunited. The aspect of their life that they want to recover. But no, according to Hissrich's team, it would be too dull to show characters just enjoying each other's company. If there's no death or misery or betrayal of some sort, people will grow disinterested, right?
Of course we had to kill more. We had to make it more painful for him.
Yeah, whenever you have a happy moment between characters, you're like, oh, that's going to go badly for them next season. In such a delicious way, I'm sure.
Yes.
It just reveals how little faith the writers have in the source material or their ability to adapt it, as they don't trust the characters to carry the show simply through their personality and wit. This plot-driven mentality, as they always look for new ways to have characters come into conflict, has led the writers to completely lose the family dynamic they claimed was so important. Why would Ciri ever want to be with Geralt and Yennefer when as soon as she first learns of them, her grandmother dies, her homes get destroyed, she gets possessed, the few people she does meet either trick her or flat out try to kill her, and her existence basically becomes this horrible series of events that winds up in countless deaths? Why does she care to be with these people when it's a generally pretty miserable experience? Really, outside of her not having an alternative, there isn't much going on there. The writers have taken their whole relationship for granted, insisting they have a true bond, but never actually taking any time to display that on screen.
Without, I think, the relationship between Tissaia and Yennefer, you wouldn't get the possibility with Yennefer and Ciri.
Do you know how many people wouldn't blink if you died?
Yennefer meets Ciri and realizes that she can be the same thing to Ciri.
Your worst fear makes such sense. Even if you were a beauty, still no one would love you.
But her mother figure, Tissaia, that we meet in episode 102, that is kind of mean and harsh to her. But in fact, they're fighting for each other and they're fighting for that relationship.
If these writers genuinely believe these to be healthy relationships, I don't know what I'm supposed to say, except please go seek therapy. They skipped any and all build-up to their kinship, relying instead on, well, that's what it was like in the source material, or it was destined to happen.
In a series where we're talking so much about destiny and so much about the choices that characters make and how they end up where they're meant to be, it's interesting to see what happens to her character when she thinks she's made all the wrong choices, because I think we kind of know that she's on the path that she's meant to be on.
Geralt adopts Ciri because people tell him to. Yennefer is the only one who can train Ciri because reasons. Vesemir can legitimately give Ciri a mortal wound that only heals due to plot contrivance, but apparently this family is real in spite of that.
We belong together. You. Us. It's not perfect, but it is real. It's yours.
They're only pitching them together because that's what the story requires.
They don't even necessarily really want to be together. They don't necessarily think they need each other. But storytelling-wise, they do.
And it doesn't work. They focused on the plot over the characters, as always, and the end result is they're just telling rather than showing, as they replaced moments of genuine intimacy with awkward dialogue that explains how much these people care for each other.
Us three will help each other. What is destined cannot be avoided.
And it shouldn't be.
The writers never honestly developed these characters or their bonds. What they really wanted was to inject drama in the mix to make sure audiences never grow bored.
So do you think Vesemir has given up on his plan to use Ciri's elder blood to try to make more Witchers?
No. No, definitely not. I'm thinking about it all the time.
And this is because, by her own admission,
And I think our fans of The Witcher expect sort of an active roller coaster for 8 episodes.
at every turn she's replaced character work with action and spectacle.
Lauren, first, thank you for introducing so many new Witchers to the universe, only to brutally murder them in season 2.
Yeah, a lot of them, yes.
That was awesome. Why did you do that?
W tym odcinku jest dobrze mieć scenę akcji, żeby ten widz cały czas jednak był jakoś tam tym zainteresowany, więc musieli...
So we started to talk about how to introduce a season-long villain, not just the monsters that Geralt is fighting in every episode.
And the fact that she believes this is what people really want just shows how little esteem she has for the fantasy genre and its enthusiasts. She believes the fans are incapable of enjoying a dialogue-focused narrative unless it gives them monsters and swords and battles, probably because she can't focus on anything different.
I do not generally binge. I may watch 2 episodes in a night, but I know my attention span, so it's at some point I've got to turn it off.
Her understanding of the fantasy genre is awful, boiling it down to the most obvious in-your-face aspects of it without grasping any of the subtlety, and it explains why the show's budget management was so terrible. Compare this to how early seasons of Game of Thrones were handled. In that show, they cut the Battle of Green Fork included in the books because they didn't have the budget to do it right, and ultimately knew that the action beats were second to the character moments. In The Witcher, they added the Battle of Sintra and Sodden Hill that were never described in the books, even though their budget could clearly not accommodate for it, leading to it looking cheap and holding none of the weight it should. It was more important to throw dumb action in your face to keep us entertained than to actually paint a coherent narrative.
This is the worst example of a Hollywood fight. You have big armies, but they don't act like armies at all, slashing left and right. No one knows what's going on. There's no formations, it seems like. There has been no preparation, no planning whatsoever. Everybody just gets together in a big mob and then slams into each other. This is such a weird scene because you see heads being split left and right, and then suddenly when the plot needs it to happen, there's a nice little pause and nobody will bother her for a little bit while she mourns this guy. It's 1 out of 10. It's a complete disaster of a depiction of battle.
This is why I'll never buy the "it's an alternate take" excuse used to justify the changes. It's a new take that only took away from the spirit of the source material by replacing characters with expanded set pieces, while adding nothing of value. These showrunners focused on the aspects of the books that made the story like every other fantasy novel, while ignoring the character stuff that made them special.
Then it doesn't matter how many cool CGI monsters I have, or how many great epic fights I have. Because if we don't care what's happening between those things, then the show will fall apart.
What Hissrich and her team don't seem to understand about Witcher is that it's not a cynical franchise. Oh, it's dark, sometimes ironic, and even downright depressing, but it's also very heartfelt, and often very funny and optimistic. It was about how these broken people in a grim world, some of who were not even human, are still capable of kindness, how a gang of monstrous mutants can show love and care to an adopted girl.
The girl was sitting on a bearskin with Cohen, tucked away in the far corner of the hall, and both were busy playing a hand-slapping game. The game was growing monotonous, as both were incredibly quick. Neither could manage to slap the other's hand in any way. This, however, clearly neither mattered to them, nor spoiled their game.
How a 100-year-old witch can still find things in the world that surprise her.
Ciri giggled, and her emerald eyes lit up devilishly. "Oh yes," she snorted. "What an expression! Do you want to see? I'll show you. Look at me." Yennefer burst out laughing.
How a princess given a duty by a higher power can still reject it and find her own path in the universe.
I'm doing what I ever wanted to do. Being who I wanted to be. I believe that's one definition of happiness.
The reason the franchise worked was that despite being filled with darker themes and evil characters, it never gave in to that. It was always about finding a silver lining to it all. The books were built on this very Slavic idea that the world is complicated and uncaring, but it isn't out to get you. That life will go on with or without you, and that's not necessarily bad. You can live in the worst place on earth and still find things to appreciate there. In a word, it felt human. Netflix's writers claim they get that.
The thing that I connected to most in the books is that you also really get to know characters who aren't being directly impacted by that battle happening over there. They just have to get up every day and keep their farming going and continue to live.
But when you look at what they put on screen, that doesn't seem true.
I want more. I have to be more because I don't know what to do in Blaviken for the rest of my life except go to the boring old market.
In order to constantly emphasize the epic narrative, this show has to make it about fixing the world to make it your own. Their narrative is that the world is out to get you and you need to fight to get a place in it. Just compare the reasoning Geralt teaches Ciri to fight in the books.
Destiny or no, Kaer Morhen is now her home, at least for a while. Training and swordsmanship amuse her, keep her healthy and fit. They allow her to forget the tragedy she has lived through. This is her home now, Triss. She has no other.
As opposed to the show.
You can't run from the world. You can't hide from it. But you can find power and purpose. A chance to survive the horror.
The former is a hopeful look at a grim world, the latter a pessimistic one. They created a cynical universe where everyone exploits each other in a self-serving effort to survive because it creates easy drama for a serialized show. Even when the show wants to be about family, it's still in a self-serving desire to find meaning, as opposed to it just being a natural occurrence that feels right.
Look, I know this means nothing to you, but I understand now how special she is. When Chaos left me, I never thought that I'd feel that spark, that life again, but Ciri, she radiates it. At Melitelli's, when I helped her control it, when she opened that portal under my direction, I felt like...
I know how it feels, Yennefer.
Like, that entire scene that's supposed to serve as the culmination of Yennefer and Ciri's mother-daughter relationship is entirely about Yennefer. In Hissrich's Witcher, no good act is unmotivated. Instead of building a story about how empathy is the reason we keep on keeping on, even when things are at their worst, her show is about how your world matters more than everyone else's. Yennefer is willing to sacrifice her friends and Ciri to get power. Jaskier twists the story of the elves to build his own reputation. Fringilla will sacrifice mages to cast some ineffectual magic that might help her get in good standing with her ruler. Vesemir is willing to risk Ciri's life to keep his Witcher lifestyle going. And each of those are fine according to the show because the world is cruel and unfair.
I will not be schooled by a man who pimps the world to some romantic adventure. My world is cruel and predictable. You enter, you survive, you die.
And sure, we might finally get the much-promised family in Season 3, but at the same time, they've already cast Missile, which means one thing. Ciri is going to get separated again, and we'll be right back to where we started in Season 1, with 3 separate plotlines that have the characters doing their own thing. So I don't buy for a second that this show will ever actually embrace this family, instead opting to rush to the next plot point so that we can get to the next set piece. Really, with this series, what you see is what you get. The badass show about badass people doing badass things in a dark fantasy world because that's what they're destined to do. People get together because destiny requires them to do that, and any bonds that form will always be the result of larger forces at play rather than actual character depth. There's no humanity to any of these dynamics, just a checklist of plot points that must be hit following standard Hollywood formulas that have been proven successful in the past. The writers are unwilling to take a gamble on the strength and originality of the source material, instead falling back on what is safest. And it's pretty obvious when you look at the amount of ideas that come from other shows and films. Their original take on the franchise is just recycled ideas from other shows the writers have worked on, such as Vampire Diaries.
Klaus needs to learn his blood to make hybrids.
With a vial of your blood, we could protect generations to come.
She's meant to be, to rebuild us.
They'll copy whatever is currently topping the box office.
I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer.
Fear is an illness. It can consume you.
He releases, and he can't control it anymore. And it's only through Ayla's singing that she manages to tame him for a second.
The world's changing.
The world is changing.
The world is changing.
Can you stop using that phrase in your movies?
Or, you know, sometimes they just unabashedly plagiarize the far superior Witcher games they insisted so much they weren't going to adapt.
Also for the fans who love the games, I think it will be very, very nice to have something new and different and fresh. And
that was the last time you interrupted me while I was talking to someone.
Whenever a lesson like this, what is yours, you do not see.
When given the opportunity to tell a completely original story in an animated format, they still made a generic Western anime with no visual style of its own. Blood Origins is also visually indistinct from any other show on the market, which is impressive when they shot on location in Iceland. It's all just stuff you've seen elsewhere done better. There is nothing worthwhile here. As Folkwalk explained in their brilliant Blood Origins essay,
this is something that I've been saying since Netflix started releasing all of their Witcher projects. They all look like a discount version of some different fantasy. The main Witcher show is a discount Game of Thrones, Nightmare of the Wolf is a discount Castlevania, and now Blood Origin is a discount Dungeons and Dragons.
This show that parades itself as a Netflix original might be made by Netflix, but it certainly isn't original. They've turned The Witcher into a trite teen drama of good versus evil, of destiny and how love triumphs over all. It's just another superhero show that is only unique due to the setting. They're using tropes to cut corners in terms of storytelling, delivering the bare minimum of what people expect, rather than offering something worthwhile and original. And these shortcuts the team took can be felt all over the show's aimless writing. They constantly go back on their own rules and world building in a desperate plea to keep audiences invested. For a show that clearly wants to become their cinematic universe with multiple spin-off shows and movies, the amount of time they set up something only to retcon it is staggering. Whether it be how they wasted so many scenes of Season 1 establishing their rules of magic.
What we didn't want to do is have a show where our characters could perform magic to get in or out of any tricky situation.
Only for that to go by the wayside in order to make magic cooler and more in line with the books, or how Nightmare of the Wolf explicitly shows 5 Witchers of the School of Wolf survive, as the rest were exterminated by mutated monsters, only for there to be dozens still alive by season 2 who happen to have never heard of mutated monsters.
Death by mutating Leshy. Find that in our annals.
Vesemir, you were literally there the last time it happened. The film also establishes there are multiple ways to kill a Leshy.
There are several ways to kill a Leshen. Behead it, sacrifice a few of its furry pets, even a few old dryad spells will do.
Before season 2 states the opposite in one episode.
Fire through the heart is the only thing that puts one down.
Before changing its mind in the next again. Or how a basilisk goes from looking like this to this in content released in the same year, which honestly just feels like they're trying to sell more toys.
My favorite monster design is the final basilisk, which is a white basilisk, and it is both beautiful and terrifying. That's the one that I can't wait to see a toy of someday. Give me white basilisk toys.
But then again, even within a season, they can't stay consistent. As I stated before, the timelines they were so proud of don't even make sense at the most basic level, but even beyond that, basic geography doesn't work in the show. In season 1, Cahir learns that Ciri is in Broccolon, sending an assassin after her, meaning he knows she is north of the Yaruga River.
Calanthe's progeny is in Broccolon Forest.
But he then later initiates the Battle of Soden Hill, based on a rumor that she's crossed the river.
If the report from the trading post is true, Cirilla may already be across the Yaruga.
So their geography is borked. But the writers don't know that. They still think Geralt and Ciri met in Broccolon.
I knew that as soon as Geralt and Ciri found each other in Broccolon, that I wanted them to go to Kaer Morhen.
Which they absolutely did not, since they cut that from the show. They met each other near Soden Hill, at Riverdale, as you can double check on their own website. But honestly, no aspect of this show is more emblematic of this tendency to retcon the show in a desperate bid to garner audience attention than the Nilfgaardian armor. Look, I'll be the first to admit it looked bad. As I've explained, not so much due to Tim Aslam's lack of talent, but due to Hissrich's management style. However, there was a logic behind why it looked this way.
And the thing with the Nilfgaardians is they were not supposed to be this elite, trained, perfectly clad army, say like the Sintrans are.
Nilfgaard, which obviously is a very powerful army as well, but is moving northward and has been moving north for a while, and conscripting new people into their army. And for us, it very quickly became like, what can look like they picked it up, they did it quickly, they put it on them. It's not meant to have the same look as a standard armor.
The idea was the creators wanted to convey that the Nilfgaardians were a ragtag, disorganized army born out of necessity, so the show could have them grow into an elite army we know from the books. While the costume didn't successfully convey this idea, there was a logic behind their design that could be iterated on. But nope, when people complained, the entire idea was promptly dropped in season 2. Suddenly, Nilfgaard has these beautiful armors, and are a martial nation that emphasizes rank and file. They didn't fix the armor, the creatives just entirely gave up on their unique vision for Nilfgaard. Rather than rethinking the design, they just scratched out their own world building. The show retconned a pretty major aspect the narrative of season 1 was putting into place, probably because they realized their original take on the series actually didn't work.
It's a chance to look at the mistakes we made in season 1 and do it better, tell stories better, improve some things, look at what didn't work and get rid of it and start over. The Nilfgaard armor will be totally different. You have that opportunity to go back and course correct if you want to.
And again, making a show is incredibly hard. I understand making mistakes, but here these mistakes are explicitly happening because they're just ignoring the source material to do their own thing. These writers have no integrity as artists. They modify the plot of the books in an attempt to make it their own, creating contradictions, and when that comes to a head, they abandon their ideas, showing how little thought is actually behind any of it. It's kind of incredible for a show that sacrificed everything that made The Witcher special for the sake of plot. They don't even stick to their own plot. The non-existent attention to detail and verisimilitude betrays a lack of care given by the producers. They've literally admitted to rewriting episodes of the show on the fly while shooting them, so it's no wonder there's no internal consistency to anything, as they just lampshade audiences rather than write a coherent narrative.
None of this makes sense.
What is this? They shouldn't be here.
It doesn't make sense. This isn't how it's supposed to work at all.
They want this to be their big cinematic universe, but are just making it up as they go along, with no actual plan or vision. And look, to be fair, it's not like the books were particularly consistent to begin with. Sapkowski's writing played fast and loose with lore. As Sapkowski puts it, I have never had any aspirations of being a creator of worlds. I was absorbed in the story and the fate of the heroes. My world is a pseudo-world. It's just a background, a fairground canvas moved by a spinning wheel. Unlike a lot of fantasy, the world of The Witcher is very much left to the imagination rather than being bogged down by previously established canon. Contradictions and conflicting information were abound, as the author clearly cared more about using this world as a backdrop for his characters to interact in than a setting for a narrative plot. But it never felt out of place or indolent, because while Sapkowski has admitted himself to being lazy, he is not stupid. He knows you need to create a semblance of unity within your text to make it feel believable, and as such, he always buried any information under a strong possibility of myth and misinformation. It was about the characters and allegories first and foremost, not the history of the continent, and that's why I love the books. But with this show, as I've explained over and over throughout this essay, it's not about characters, it's about plot, the fate of the world, the epic storylines, and the grandiose spectacle. Netflix has explicitly built their franchise as this sprawling story set across millennia, with spin-offs supposed to fill in gaps in the world's history. So these inconsistencies no longer make sense. They want us to grow invested in the world, focusing on the high stakes over the small-scale personal drama, yet can't even bring that to life in a consistent fashion. There's no interconnectedness between the different parts of the Witcher Netflix universe. Why the hell should I be invested in it? These writers got their hands on the one fantasy franchise where you don't need to get bogged down in detail, yet still try to expand every part of it, because that's what successful franchises do these days. But due to their lack of understanding of the appeal of the source material and the fantasy genre as a whole, they created a world with no internal consistency that is impossible to care about. So who is this show for? The honest truth, I don't think the showrunners even know. How could they identify who their viewers are when they clearly don't get why the source material connects with them?
Everyone is different. This is the most diverse fan base I've ever experienced. And so I had to come to terms with the fact that there was going to be disappointment for someone along the way.
Oczywiście premiera każdego sezonu to jest taka wielka niewiadoma, to jest zawsze takie oczekiwanie na te pierwsze wyniki, zobaczymy jaka jest dynamika, jak to się rozwija, jak to będzie oglądane. Wiele się wydarzyło przez te 2 lata i też widownia się zmienia, wiesz, to nie jest tak, że...
Coś innego, co jest pod spodem tego, co powiedziałeś. To co mówisz, to że nie, wy młodzi, oglądając to, co oglądacie, robicie swoim mózgom to, że ja nie wiem już, jak mam robić serial, żebyście go chcieli oglądać.
Nie, ale ja generalnie jakoś tam mam wyczucie, staram się też jakby orientować to, co przesuwa nam się troszeczkę takie ostrze tej widowni masowej w stronę kina trochę mniej liniowego, trochę mniej spójnego.
They double down on anything that resonates with viewers, but the way they implement that betrays a lack of understanding. Once the fuck memes spread across the internet, they focused even more on the catchphrase, quadrupling the amount of F-bombs in Season 2.
Fucking fucky. Fuck.
You guys do get those memes where making fun of how much of a simpleton you've made Geralt right. This wasn't people asking for you to make every character spew cusses left and right, especially not Yennefer and Jaskier, two of the most quick-witted people in the books. Similarly, they keep writing new songs, desperately attempting to recreate the lightning in a bottle they captured with Toss a Coin to Your Witcher.
I think if we said that Jaskier didn't come back, the protests, I feel like we would have death threats, like we would be overthrown.
Never with any real success, because they don't seem to get the various factors that made the scene iconic in the first place. Meanwhile, they only ever respond to criticism with surface-level cosmetic changes. Hissrich will engage people on Twitter to make it seem like they're listening to feedback. The trailer for Season 2 was designed as a direct response to criticism, from including the something more line they cut in Season 1 to showing Triss's new hair, the new Nilfgaardian armor, and Jaskier's hat. All the stuff that people complained about online. But am I supposed to cheer when they mechanically addressed a couple of simple cosmetic changes, but addressed none of the underlying issues related to the writing?
That being said, there might be a small amount of hat in it for about 47 seconds.
Wow, a few characters look a bit closer to their game counterparts. Guess that excuses the actual content, the meaningful moments and character dynamics from the source material they claim to love so much being butchered beyond recognition.
So we crafted a new story for her, but I think
especially people who love the books, are going to be able to find a lot of direct, like page-to-page correlation.
After each season, she'll claim next season will be more book accurate. Their excuse for the changes to the second season was the book it was based on was a lot of setup and world building.
We also knew, though, that Blood of Elves, which season 2 covers, was going to be a particularly difficult book to adapt from the very beginning. It's a book where there's a lot of beautiful character moments and things happen, but there's not a lot of forward-moving plot. It's more about setting the table for, the third book, The Time of Contempt, the third season as well. So we knew that we would have to inject some new stories in there.
But that's a blatant lie, because she said the exact same thing about the books that inspired season 1.
Season 1 was a lot of setup. I think I've made the analogy of setting the chessboard. There was a lot to initiate the audience to. So, who these characters are, what their jobs are, how they're viewed in the world of The Witcher, how they're viewed on the continent. All of that had to be done to sort of understand the stakes of the series. And I feel like that groundwork was laid. So now we actually just get to do the play chess. We get to actually play.
Season 2 was already written by the time the criticism for season 1 came in.
What was really interesting is we had written season 2 by the time season 1 came out. So we kind of had to learn those lessons retroactively.
The same thing with season 3.
Not only has work already started, the writer's room is almost finished.
So why would you ever believe things are about to change? She'll say she doesn't need to invent material before stating the absolute opposite.
So it would be a straight translation of the books. I think that one of the beauties of sort of building out a Witcher universe, if you will, is that you can actually use those spin-offs to do slightly different things than the books did. But to me, that makes it actually even more important that in the Mothership series, we always stick to what Sapkowski intended. We had to do a little bit of invention in season 2. We had to sort of fill out some of the storylines for our characters. And that gave us this opportunity to do exactly that, to say, we have all of these amazing characters set up from season 1. How do we start intersecting them in ways that even fans wouldn't expect? No, I just think there's so much material that I don't feel the need to start inventing my own to keep it going. And some of my favorite scenes this season, I think for Anya especially, for Yennefer's character, she has a couple of pairings that are incredible that you wouldn't expect at all.
So I think there will be a lot of fun pairings of relationships that fans will hopefully really be looking forward to and expecting, and also some new fun ones.
She'll promise she's not adapting the games, only to then state she wants to inject as many references to them as she can. She uses doublespeak, claiming one thing and its opposite, distorting her own words, because really, all she'll ever say is what she thinks will get you to watch.
The books start with a series of short stories called The Last Wish, which is my favorite book of the series.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got him.
All the showrunners ever do to address feedback is sprinkle in Easter eggs and references in a desperate bid to appeal to a fan base they clearly don't get.
So Vesemir in the bathtub, it's a different twist on Geralt in the bathtub. Every Witcher property needs one of these scenes now. I think it's a new rule. It's a new rule for any Witcher show, bathtub scene. Little Easter eggs that to me just is going to lend so much to the main series.
There's a lot of little Easter eggs in the show that are basically just there to say, like, video gamers, we see you. Like, we know you're here too, and we know that you love The Witcher, and, and not just because of the books. So we just want to throw out little things to you as well.
And we wanted to make sure that we had mentioned, the Wild Hunt in season 1, for instance. It's in the pilot. So that we can say, like, we hear you fans, we know that this is a big deal. The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, I mean, it's what the fans know.
How do you plant the seeds for the new series in season 2? Do we have seeds, Easter eggs?
You absolutely have Easter eggs. There are a lot of characters, actually, that pop up in Blood Origin in kind of unexpected ways.
It's been really exciting to kind of find little points of connection between the worlds.
We're using every sort of fun moment we can to plant an Easter egg or to make sure we're using actual dialogue from the books.
You'll see there's a monster board, and eagle-eyed fans will see some other creatures in there that are mentioned in the books.
Reminds me of this infamous interview from the producers of X-Men Wolverine trying to justify changes they made to Deadpool.
It's red, his head is red, and he's got black diamonds here. Since we bring him out in the middle of his being operated on, we couldn't put him in a uniform.
This Witcher is not the Witcher we know, who's human-like and, can take potions and have powers, and it's 1.0.
This is about origins. So Deadpool is not going to ever come to his complete fruition as Deadpool as the fans know it in the comic books.
Ithlin and Avalak and Eredin, especially with Avalak and Eredin, painting them from their baby stages where they're still quite innocent and they haven't been corrupted, and they become this multi-layered dark creatures in the games and the books.
So we're saying we know he's supposed to have those diamonds, and he is that character, and here it is.
One of the things that we discovered is obviously there are some great tie-ins that we can have. So Avalak, Eredin, these are characters that any Witcher fan knows are going to come back much later in the saga. We get to actually meet them when they're a little more naive, when they haven't had all of the experiences that have perhaps hardened them or turned them into those characters that we know.
Yes, we deliberately took Deadpool and gave him certain things and attributes in the past that has never been seen in the comics. Good. We hope we surprised you a little.
What's a journey that fans are going to love and will still surprise them, but also a journey that makes sense to hopefully the new viewers.
Hissrich's approach to adaptation is just clueless, understanding visual cues without any of the depth below that. They'll change simple stuff like costumes and wigs because it's relatively low investment to garner some goodwill. Similarly, they'll write in references to beloved moments in the books and games in ways that cut just short of having the characters look into the camera knowingly so they can claim they're giving the people what they want.
And so we did want to craft a story of her own. In the books, she's blinded at Sodden, and we actually make several references to being blind for Yennefer this season.
This is my dear friend.
Dear friend. Really expect me to believe that unicorns exist?
Of course they do. I used to own a stuffed one until it broke under mysterious circumstances.
But all it ever is shallow, with no understanding of what these moments meant in the first place, often even changing their meaning in the context of the show.
I would love to say that all of that is planned out perfectly. Sometimes, though, it's pure coincidence. There are things that I look back in season 1 and I think, thank God, like someone threw that line in there. And then we've continued to sort of play with it and expand it in later seasons.
In many ways, when you look at the worst writing decisions they make, it seems to be them taking fan favorite moments from the games and trying to one-up them. In the games, Eskel says,
"Fuck yeah! Summon the bitches!"
So in the show, he must bring in an entire harem to Kaer Morhen. Oh, people like the Crones of Crookback Bog? Better make an evil witch a season-long villain. Oh, people like it when Geralt says,
"Place of power, it's gotta be."
Better make Monolith the driving force behind most of the show's plot. Oh, the games have a big battle at Kaer Morhen? Better do our version of that. It's also why Season 2 and Nightmare of the Wolf rode in Aleshi, because it's a fan-favorite monster from the games, and they thought injecting that in would appease the fans. But it really is emblematic of how little they understand their audience, as this transparent attempt to appeal to the fans of the games only wound up pissing them off as it led to the pointless death of Eskel, a fan-favorite character. But really, nowhere is this complete lack of understanding of the source material simpler to explain than through Hissrich's choice to call Dandelion by his Polish name, Jaskier.
There's been some drama about the fact that I chose to write Jaskier as Jaskier and not Dandelion as he is known in English.
Because not translating Jaskier into English is like not translating the White Wolf or the Butcher of Blaviken in other languages. It doesn't make sense because it's not a name. His name is Julian Alfred Pancratz, Viscount of Lettenhove. No, Dandelion is a title, one that should evoke the emotions the bard wants to convey to his audience. By not translating Jaskier, you're actually losing a large amount of the backstory for the character. The title Dandelion, or Buttercup as it literally translates from the Polish, told you all you needed to know about him. How he was flamboyant, poetic, romantic, and perhaps just a tad effeminate. But Jaskier just leaves you with a strange name that means nothing to English viewers, and that the actors themselves seem to struggle to even pronounce.
Jennifer, Tisaya,
Calanthe, Calanthai.
Jaskier, oh, so many.
And yet this is supposed to be evidence that this show is more true to the books than the games? No, it isn't. On the contrary, it shows how the writers read the books and then did less than the bare minimum of research. Literally, Hissrich's justification for doing this was that Dandelion's name was mispronounced in the audiobooks, and that confused her. They took everything at face value and never actually stopped to try and understand how it all came together, why details were added to these stories in the ways they were, why stuff connected with audiences. The writers seem unable to understand any subtext found in Sapkowski's words, and it leads to baffling decisions such as these, changes for the sake of changes that weaken the strength of this show as an adaptation. They are not adapting the books, they are transcribing the written word without any appreciation of the themes and intent, and then just adding crap on top of that. And this is exactly what makes the show so malicious, because when you look on paper, most of the elements are there. The visuals on the surface look right. The story beats in season 1 and even season 2 are for the most part present and accounted for. But it never feels like it because it either misses the point of the scenes they are adapting or straight up changes their meaning to be something completely different. The original text has clearly been read, but it's not been understood. It's a very upsetting thing to see these characters experience what they underwent in the books, only for them to take a completely different lesson from it. Ciri eventually finds Geralt, but that only happens because her grandmother told her to search for him rather than her feeling a father-daughter connection with him. Yennefer had a difficult childhood, but never uses that to truly appreciate the pleasures of her new life. Jaskier writes a song about meeting Filavandrel in order to be famous, rather than keeping their encounter secret out of respect for their suffering, and Geralt takes the hatred the world shows towards him as an excuse to push everyone away, rather than valuing the few friendships he actually does have. In the show, the lessons learned from their adventures are the opposite of what they were in the books.
People linked by destiny will always find each other.
And this is why it's one of the worst adaptations I have ever had the displeasure of seeing. It's not the undercooked visuals or the bad writing or the messy structure that ruined the show. It's the fact that its intent seems at complete odds with the original's vision.
It's wrong. It's all wrong!
The moral of these stories, their heart has been twisted beyond recognition into something with far less personality and soul. And look, despite everything I've said, it is completely possible that Lauren Hissrich does love and care for the source material. Hissrich promotes the books and even the games enough when she really doesn't need to, for me to believe she actually wants people to give the source material a go. There are enough statements by her that I genuinely agree with and make it possible that she on some level does understand the appeal. It is entirely possible that this was a genuine attempt to elevate these books and get them to appeal to a new audience. That Hissrich got overwhelmed or worse, disillusioned by her new role as a showrunner.
I've been writing in television for 20 years. This is my first time being a showrunner. It's a really hard job.
When you look at the way she repeats how difficult it is for her to spend months in Europe away from her family.
You know, I'm a mom, I have a family, my family's in Los Angeles now. I am leaving them to come work on a daily basis. So I have what I call my no asshole policy, which is exactly that. If we're going to leave our families to come work together, please be kind, be respectful.
How much she shares her drinking habits on social media and posts what can only be described as unprofessional drunk tweets. It paints a picture of someone that's kind of burnt out by the production process. It seems more than likely that Hissrich really wanted the show to be a good, faithful adaptation that would both please the fans and newcomers, if for no other reason that it would make her more money. But following the behind-the-scenes drama of season 1 and its grueling, disorganized production, all for the show to ultimately receive a pretty mixed reception, she just stopped putting in the same love and care.
What really shifted in season 2 was my understanding that, one, I didn't have to work so hard to prove myself. I was there, I was doing the job, and the show was good and people were happy.
The fact that she's reportedly not writing a single episode of season 3 indicates to me she wants out, but can't because this show is her life now. She can't drop out without risking her career, and that fatigue and lack of enthusiasm has led to larger and larger drops in quality with each season. If that's what happened, it's sad, but I can empathize with that failure. Running any creative process is ridiculously difficult. Ultimately, like the books always show, nothing is ever black and white. Hissrich is not necessarily some greedy hack that exploited an established franchise to push her terrible ideas. She can love the books and still make a bad adaptation. But honestly, I really hope that wasn't the case. I genuinely hope this show wound up this way because the showrunners didn't care and simply wanted to make a quick buck, because the alternative is so much sadder. If she genuinely cared and this disastrous crashing house of cards was still the best she could deliver, that's heartbreaking for everyone. Imagine wanting to do right by the fans, having all this money and resources at your disposal, only for your lack of talent to get in the way of that, as your ideas wound up undermining everything that made this franchise special. I really hope they never cared, and not that this happened due to sheer incompetence, because at least the former means she was successful in what she set out to do, that is, create a bland fantasy show for the masses. The latter, on the other hand, means it was a failure for everyone involved, from way atop the production process all the way down to the audience, as despite all her good intentions, she damaged this franchise catastrophically. But frankly, even if Hissrich does actually care about the source material, members of the team she hired clearly don't, which doesn't reflect great on her. The writer's complete lack of humility definitely paints a less flattering image of their intentions. They have pretty transparently been exploiting the goodwill of the fans of the franchise, as opposed to actually taking their concerns and criticism to heart. As Season 3's writer Javier Grillo Marx-Watch so elegantly put it when Blood Origins' disastrous reception occurred, on days like this, I'm reminded of a scene in the Howard Stern movie Private Parts, where the rating guy explains that people who love the show listen to it for an hour a day on average, and people who hated it listen to it for 3 hours a day on average.
The average Howard Stern fan listens for, are you ready for this? An hour and 20 minutes.
How can that be?
Answer most commonly given. I want to see what he'll say next.
All right, okay, fine. But what about the people who hate Stern?
Good point. The average Stern hater listens for 2.5 hours a day.
Look, but if they hate him, why do they listen?
Most common answer, I want to see what he'll say next.
Might I remind you that this is him defending the worst reviewed Netflix original ever. His mentality is clearly that the quality of the show doesn't matter, since the audience will always be there. And what I hate is that on some level, he is right.
Am I wrong? No, you're not wrong. Am I wrong? You're not wrong, Walter. You're just an asshole. Okay, then.
You don't want to know how many hours I have dedicated to this show, time I will never get back. I did that out of respect for these writers, attempting to understand why they made decisions. I made a genuine effort to empathize with them, to acknowledge the difficulties they must have gone through and explain in a clear and civil manner why it still didn't click with fans. But now, I realize that is a courtesy these writers would never grant me. I will never again make the mistake of giving them the benefit of the doubt when they have nothing but contempt for people such as myself, viewing us as nothing more than arrogant idiots who will just consume whatever they put out as long as the Witcher brand is slapped on it. And it's obvious when you look at the rate they keep churning stuff out. Before Season 1 was released, there was already talks of Season 2 and a spin-off, but as it turns out, there was no ideas behind them. As Bo DeMaio said about Nightmare of the Wolf, when Lauren first asked me to take a stab at this, we didn't have much. It was literally, hey, this is cool, let's do an anime. There's a lot of opportunities here. Think of a couple of ideas. Meanwhile, Blood Origins is the birth child of a dream Declan DeBarra had, based on a paper-thin plot that, by his own admission, could fit on a napkin.
He basically sat down, wrote it all on a napkin, then took that napkin, texted me the whole thing, which I still have on my texts, which basically lays out everything. It's like, who are the main characters? What clans are they part of? You know, what was the royalty looking for? What were going to be the big conflicts? Were we going to get to meet monsters? I mean, it had everything. And I will say that it hasn't shifted all that much since then.
Season 2's dialogue was literally written by pulling words out of a hat. They are just making it up, not actually putting any thought behind any of it, and definitely not waiting to see if it makes sense for the story.
I do not outline it really detailed unless I have to for another boss, but left to my own devices, I do a really sort of more like a beat sheet than an outline. And then I dive in because I like to sort of find the beginning and ends of scenes as I'm writing them.
How you have planted these seeds that come to bloom later, so much later, and they're even just tossed off, and yet they are a whole storyline later. It's so wonderful for fans.
It is most of the time on purpose, sometimes just the most amazing coincidence that we're like, oh, thank God someone said that in Season 1.
Oh, wow.
We're gonna make that work. Sometimes, though, it's pure coincidence. There are things that I look back in Season 1 and I think, thank God, like someone threw that line in there.
How is this happening? All the books are already released. You could just read them to know where the story's going. The whole thing is a mess trying to capitalize on the brand as quickly as possible. When Lauren Hissrich says she has a long-term plan, I don't believe that for a second.
I'm so glad that 7 seasons is the thing that people picked up on, though, because I think at some point I also said like 20 seasons, and if people really expected me to be, you know, I'll be retired by then.
And this season, it's like, you know, Season 4 of a good workplace drama. I'm not in a rush to get through these stories. You know, we approximately do a book a season.
In 2 seasons, we're already midway through the 4th book. They are rushing through these novels with no real goal, just looking to exploit a fan base that quite frankly doesn't know better.
Hands up here who doesn't know what a Witcher is.
Who doesn't know what a Witcher is? There's a couple of people. I don't know.
There's actually quite a few.
Tell them, Henry.
Okay.
Tell them.
She can sell this show on Book Accurate because on the surface, it is. It looks like Witcher to the average viewer. It's got a gray-haired monster hunter who hooks up with badass witches. and then any criticism lobbed her way by people invested gets deflected with the "it's open to interpretation" or "it's a different take" excuse. But there is doing a different take, and then there is completely uprooting the moral of these stories. Hissrich justifies her alterations to the source material by claiming the books were about how the same narrative can be interpreted in different ways. As she puts it, it's not like every single Witcher production will be aimed at everyone. I have no illusions of that. There is no way to create something that everyone will like, but you can build several different things to suit different groups. There is a fantastic opening in one of the chapters where we have an elven version of a fairy tale and a human version of that fairy tale. And these are two versions of the same story. They are radically different. Someone else's bad is someone else's good, and they have quite the opposite meaning.
Everyone has their own version of what they would want in The Witcher, how they would want the stories told, what they think the characters look like, what is important from the books that has to be there, what can be lost.
And I'm gonna be blunt here, she's wrong. Once again, she has boiled down everything to the text, ignoring the subtext. Because yes, the books pointed out how different people might view a story differently, but Sapkowski also demonstrated why this was to the detriment of the truth. The passage of baptism of fire she's referring to is about Lara Doran's fairy tale, and shows how both sides manipulated their narrative to their needs. The humans frame the elf as a maniacal witch, while the elves depict her as an innocent victim. Yet both sides ignore critical facts in order to push their version of the narrative. The humans admit that Lara's child was adopted by a half-human queen who showed kindness to their kind, and the elves ignore that same queen was herself eventually murdered by Falka, an elf. The point of this section is not that any interpretation of a story is valid. On the contrary, the point was to show how easy it is for people to manipulate the misinformed and to disguise lies as truths. Sapkowski never claimed that truth is relative. All he ever did was critique those that took advantage of the moral grayness of the world to manipulate facts for their own gain.
I didn't tell him everything. I know. I'm not guilty of anything. Yes, you are.
This section, and most of the books for that matter, were about how you should put in the effort to understand others, and that meant never taking anything at face value. You should always ask yourself what did the author intend here, and from that, figure out the truth. But Hissrich is trying to convince us that it's the very opposite, claiming any version of this story is legitimate because truth is relative. She did exactly what Sapkowski condemned. She took someone else's story and twisted its morals to fit her desires. I'm not saying she can't make cuts and changes. Some of my favorite films ever are adaptations that took sizable liberties from the source material. But an adaptation, especially one such as this that claims to be true to the source material, should at the very least retain the thematic underpinnings of the original text. You can't just handpick the parts you like, prop those up, and drop the stuff you don't without completely misrepresenting the ideas of the original author. Hissrich has admitted to this disgusting approach to adaptation, stating in interviews, "When we start a season, and it's always been my goal to cover about a book a season, the writers come in, we talk about the books that we're doing, we talk about what we like from the story, what we want to keep from the story, and what are the most important benchmarks for our characters that we want to hit. After we've figured out what our main events are, the next thing we have to do is look at what the stories aren't doing for us and figure out how we bolster them with what we need." You can't approach adaptation this way.
So sometimes we move those chess pieces around a little bit. There's a big story from Blood of Elves that we're going to do in season 3, for instance. Or there was a short story that we couldn't fit in season 1, so we put it in season 2. We try to be pretty flexible with that.
It's not a collection of individual ideas that you can rearrange how you like. It's a complete package with pieces placed in specific ways for very specific reasons. This is what Sapkowski meant when he told her,
which is to represent the spirit of the work more than the actual page to page itself.
While art and stories are open to interpretation, not all interpretations of said art are valid, because otherwise you can justify anything. And the worst part is, Hissrich has demonstrated her complete lack of respect and understanding for the written word for years. Even on her first job working on the West Wing, she was making cuts to scripts that negatively impacted the material she was being handed.
From Erin, I learned an absolute love for language. When I was a writer's assistant one time, one of my jobs was editing scripts, and I did so, and I changed a word thinking that he had forgotten something, and it shot. And afterwards, he was like, "Who did that?" And I realized, it was one word. It didn't change the meaning of the sentence, but it changed everything in his mind because it didn't sound the same.
This has always been her MO. And ironically, all of this was fairly prophetic on Sapkowski's part.
It's not worth worrying about storytellers. If they don't have enough material, they'll make things up anyway. And if they do have authentic material at their disposal, they'll distort it.
Hissrich got away with hand-selecting the parts she liked of the source material and dumping the rest because she made it look enough like The Witcher to trick audiences into believing it was book accurate. Hissrich has made criticism of this show incredibly difficult by keeping just enough from the source material that she can hide behind the creative liberties excuse, when in reality, this show at its core spits in the face of every theme Sapkowski explored in his novels, from the rejection of destiny to Yennefer's self-empowerment to every other thing I have criticized throughout this essay. This justification that the changes Hissrich made are somehow okay because it's her interpretation of this story is disingenuous, as it goes against the themes of the books. It's just a completely transparent band-aid used to justify how bad of an adaptation this all is, a shield against criticism. Hissrich has gone on record saying she dislikes adaptations, commenting on how they are always worse than the original text, which is hilarious because the last decade of her career has been adapting other people's work.
When I was offered the job on Daredevil, which was my first of many things, my first genre show, my first show with Netflix, I had embarrassingly never even read a comic book before then.
The big thing that I learned on Daredevil and Defenders and Umbrella Academy is about adaptation and about taking something that has a huge fan base and that people really, really love in its existing form and translating it to a new form. And the changes that have to be made between a comic book and television, or between a beloved book series and television.
In a sense, this is her admitting that none of her material has been good.
What I will say that those shows gave to me, though, is a chance to sort of let my shoulders down and relax and not overthink.
She's hiding the fact that she is a mediocre writer by working with source material far stronger than anything she can ever come up with. Her biggest contribution to this franchise has for some reason been baby murder 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fucking times, which is such a weird thing to keep injecting in one's writing that I honestly don't feel I have the psychological insight to properly analyze it.
There's a lot of violence in the show, there's sex in the show, there's blood, there's dead babies.
That's the first time I've seen this clip without a VFX slug across it that says "Make Baby Dead."
Make baby dead. That's what it says. I saw it too. Make baby dead.
Yeah, for months now it said "Make Baby Dead."
Baby
so
dead.
it's really nice to see it with a dead baby.
Beyond that, her unfocused writing managed to undermine the themes of family, inclusion, and female empowerment she claims were so important to her. If you look at it as its own original spin on the franchise, it's messy at best, and if you look at it as a proper adaptation, it's straight up awful. This world and its potential clearly did not inspire Hissrich to create something great. Again, Netflix essentially goaded her into pitching for the show when she was ambivalent to the prospect. It is evident that whatever success sprang from the show's first season, it was in spite of, not thanks to, Lauren Hissrich. And it's frustrating to see, as the parts of the show audiences connect to are the aspects closest to the books, and every change to the source material has been met with a mixture of confusion and frustration by both newcomers and established fans. It really speaks to the strength of Sapkowski's source material that even after such a bastardization of these stories, the strength and magic of these characters still shines through the hard work of all the people Hissrich has screwed over the course of the production. Some of the entertainment value of Sapkowski's book, some of those little nuggets of gold still get a slight moment in the spotlight, enough to give audiences hope this is going somewhere, a promise that this could be something special. But it's fool's gold. Anyone who is remotely familiar with the source material could see it after season 1. That season was all set up and the chess pieces were all in the wrong positions to actually let the true brilliance of the source material get its moment. And now, after season 2's changes, it's even worse. Which is not something I can say for the games. The games also played fast and loose with canon, making changes, some of which I think were to the detriment of the narrative. But while the plots might have been messy, the underlying spirits of the books, the characters and their relationships to each other and the world they inhabited, that was always present. It didn't matter that they changed what the Wild Hunt wanted or what the White Frost was, because when Geralt, Yen, Dandelion, and Ciri were on screen, I saw Geralt, Yen, Dandelion, and Ciri. I saw their history, their complex dynamics, and above all else, their various attitudes towards the world. That never happens in the show. Where the games focused on the characters at the expense of the plot, the show focused on the plot at the expense of the characters. Any relationship to the source material is purely cosmetic, like a different creature wearing the skin of a deceased friend. These characters never give us the perspective on events they should, show the traits that made us fall in love with them. Oh sure, Hissrich can have Geralt carrying one sword instead of two. A broken clock is right twice a day. But most of the time, her understanding of the source material is just embarrassing, like when she interpreted Iced having a dark face as meaning he had dark skin and had to be corrected on social media, or the time she argued the Killanth having brown hair was book accurate when she made that choice based on the erroneous English translation. Honestly, I couldn't care less about the color of Killanth's hair or Iced's skin, but the fact that she'll argue with fans over things she is clearly wrong about really bothers me. She seems to believe she has some form of ownership over the source material.
I like to say that for the series, we actually get to find the story that's happening between the lines in the books,
when really her knowledge of them is limited to the barest of minimums and often wrong. She'll transform character motivations and personalities without even realizing it, leading to contradictions. It forces her to go around giving in-depth explanations on social media to justify the changes, which plays well with uninformed crowds. It makes her seem like an open showrunner, transparent about the creative process, but all it really is damage control. If you constantly need to go to Twitter to justify and explain why things are happening the way they are in your show, then there is probably something rotten in how you are writing it. It reveals that the show can't stand on its own merit, leeching off people's love for the series and depending on behind-the-scenes commentary to fill the gaping plot holes her writing creates. This is not how it works. If you want to tell a story with original characters, then write a new original story that makes sense for them. Don't use someone else's story to bolster your own original creations. It's not like the adventures of an albino warrior that uses alchemy and herbs to stay fit in an alternative medieval setting and who is given the title of White Wolf is a particularly original one. Michael Murdoch was doing that with his Elric saga as far back as in 1961. No, what set The Witcher aside was the lessons its protagonist gave us, the philosophy that drove the characters forward. So once you take that away, you are left with a show that is at best mediocre, and at worst spits in the face of the literature and culture it's stealing from for the sake of cashing in on an established fan base. And they know they can get away with it. The vast majority of audiences don't realize how much she's twisted Sapkowski's stories and don't realize how much they're missing out on. This is why I don't accept the excuse of, well, it's better than nothing. It isn't, when it's actively misrepresenting The Witcher to a misinformed audience. That first season robbed them of something far greater without their knowledge, and they only became savvy to that when the writing standards dropped even further, and Cavill left the project. At that point, any notion that this product was anything short of a disaster was lost even among the least knowledgeable of fans. This wasn't some change to the source material which could hide behind the excuse of freedom of adaptation. This was something palpable. The very thing Hissrich herself put forward as the soul of the adaptation was gone, even if you had no knowledge of The Witcher outside of the show, which, if that's the case, I'm so sorry. This was clearly tangible evidence that something was very, very wrong. I would call this whole thing fan fiction, but well, the people behind it would have to actually be fans for that to be true. When the showrunner says she loves the books, I can't see it as anything other than faux passion. They don't care for the IP. The whole thing has been from day one made with a good enough mentality.
I'm in editorial for season 3 right now, and it's funny because there are always a list of like, oh, I wish we could have done that. I wish it would have looked like this. I wish we could redo this. That's just part of making television, though. And so we have to put out the very best product that we can. And yeah, there's always going to be things that we certainly, and we know the audience is going to go like, oh, okay. So I had to come to terms with the fact that there was going to be disappointment for someone along the way. There's no way to please everyone.
Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Hissrich was hired because she was able to deliver a show on a tight schedule and under budget.
So I keep a very strict schedule for myself, which doesn't involve sitting around waiting for, some sort of gorgeous ideas to hit me. Sometimes it's just about the work.
In fact, you're taught that you're supposed to spend all of your time alone and, just like give into the whims of inspiration. And it could not be less that. My job, as I said, is about schedule and timeliness.
That's it. She's a Hollywood politician, a PR person. She constantly explains how working on this has been a learning experience.
This is the first show that I've ever run. I came to The Witcher having never done the show running job before. And it was a big job to start out on.
Perhaps this is because I'm new to this job. I want to stay and get better at it. I want to continue learning and evolving and making sure that I'm giving my very best to this show.
I think there are episodes that are more successful than others. I'm certainly still learning how to do it.
I'd never seen a colorist work before. I had never seen someone go through an episode and say that blood is not quite red enough or that sky is not quite gray enough. It's amazing. When you watch a show that's not well colored, you're like, oh, now I understand. But I never knew that part of the process even happened.
But like, we don't want it to be a learning experience. We just want it to be good from the start. When you're getting paid enough to buy a $4.4 million mansion, I expect you to actually put in some work. At $10 million an episode, I expect some of that to show on screen. You can be a money-oriented creative and still have artistic integrity. Sapkowski, with his bachelor's of economics and pragmatic approach to licensing his work, is kind of the poster child for someone who wants to make money first but can still create great art. But with Hissrich, I have never seen anything other than someone who was looking to bolster their career at the expense of their art. And this is why, regardless of her skills as a writer, I believe she was an even worse fit for the showrunner position. Her management style has been disastrous, as she hired people she didn't work well with, making promises she clearly didn't care to keep, causing disruptions in the whole production process, all in an effort to fast-track the release and cash in faster on a gullible audience. She lets writers do whatever the hell they want with the world, to the point that the show not only contradicts the books, it contradicts its own world building. She subjected her cast and crew to less than ideal work conditions due to her inability to work in a collaborative fashion with them, and her handling of it was so bad that she lost the one thing that attracted fans to the property. All she ever did was cut corners left and right to please her employers at Netflix, pushing to produce more and more at the expense of what little quality was there. This is a job for her, one that's making her a shit ton of money. It's not an actual opportunity to tell a story she needed to tell.
If you ask me what a Witcher is a monster hunter. Thank God they asked Henry what a Witcher was, because he gave about a 5-minute diatribe about growing up and children and elixirs and mutagenic alchemy.
I was like, what is he on about?
Like, what is mutagenic alchemy again? Yeah, I had read The Last Wish about a year before Netflix decided to make the show, and I was madly in love with it. I didn't know that I was going to do this, but no, it's a great book. Henry's story about the books is a little bit more interesting.
All Hissrich saw, and still sees in this franchise, is a career opportunity. A chance to become a showrunner for the first time. To have a popular property entirely under her thumb, and to manage a massive multimedia franchise, regardless of what it was. With the only real goal being to bump her up the social ladder.
You smell that? What is that?
What?
What's that smell?
A cologne?
No.
Opportunity.
No. Money.
Oh, okay.
I smell money.
Okay.
The show could get cancelled, and I'm sure she wouldn't be too hung up on not getting to finish the story, since Netflix have already signed her on to produce new original content for them. This show gave her job security. In fact, she's already jumping ship, as she's reportedly not writing a single episode for season 3, letting others handle the bulk of the creative work. It's just a source of income that she can let run on its own, while she goes off and does something she probably cares more about.
Well, you hear that thing where people say, you know, in Hollywood, if they do a money job, and then one that they're more passionate about, they go, one for them and one for me. It's like, really? You got 5 million doing one for them? So generous.
And look, this is not necessarily uncommon in the industry. People come and go from shows all the time, as writers' rooms constantly evolve depending on scheduling and enthusiasm. But here, I can't help but look at the products they are churning out and see it as just another symptom of their lack of artistic integrity, care, or genuine passion found in this project. That you can't tell me they are invested in seeing this story told properly, when most of the team seemed more interested in the next big gig. Like I said, if they actually do care, it's honestly sadder because none of that is coming through on screen due to their complete lack of talent. So I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume their ability was not what limited them, and that they are just in it for the clout and paycheck. So congratulations to the team, and Hissrich in particular, I guess. You all played the game and won big. I just wish that hadn't come at the expense of my favorite book series. At the end of the day, what upsets me about this show is not the fact that the writing is bad, that the showrunner's goals seem to fundamentally clash with the intent of the books, that the characters and their relationships have been butchered beyond recognition, that the visuals are at best passable or at worst 20 years behind the times, that the world building is some of the worst in the business, or that the showrunners exploited the goodwill of their fans and their employees in order to turn a profit quickly, and it is not the fact that the storylines stray from that of the books. No, what kills me with this show is that in spite of the ludicrous amount of money Netflix has been throwing at this franchise, the best the team was ever capable of was boring. They took Witcher, a fantastic deconstruction of what the fantasy genre could be, and all they managed to bring out of that was the most bog-standard bland fantasy show whose most interesting aspect is all the behind-the-scenes drama. They were given free rein to make whatever they wanted with the IP, and still managed to make something devoid of anything to connect to emotionally, reducing it to the show where Henry Cavill kills monsters and protects a magical girl, and as I feel I've demonstrated all throughout this essay, they don't even do that well. Why adapt a unique franchise with a very special take on the world and a lot of cultural baggage if you never actually wanted to adapt that? Why remove everything that made this IP special for the sake of broad appeal? It's like finding a rock with a diamond in it and getting rid of the diamond so you can enjoy the rock. It's just lazy and stupid. Ultimately, in 10 years, who will remember this show? Audiences will only remember this generic trash for the memes and Henry Cavill. Other than that, they will move on from this shallow teen drama without a second thought. So the only people who will remember this show in a decade will be the ones who actually care, the ones who genuinely love these characters and these stories. That is to say, the fans of both the games and the books. Ultimately, in situations like these, they are the only ones who lose, because they actually wanted this show to be worth remembering. We didn't want to hate this show, on the contrary, we wanted it to help others understand why we cared so much for this franchise. But instead, the producers found it easier to grind it down into a bland, risk-averse series, a show that can be enjoyed by many, but never really truly loved by anyone. They aim to titillate audiences' constant need for dumb entertainment without ever challenging them with new original ideas. Fuck the fans, I guess, for actually wanting to connect with something on a deeper level than pure distraction. The positive reviews Hissrich's Witcher receives are honestly just depressing. Stuff like, but the new characters don't get much detail or backstory, making it difficult to fully appreciate or invest in them. Most of these characters, and therefore Blood Origins itself, remain frustratingly limited, like rough sketches that haven't quite been fleshed out enough. Stellar characters, great performances, killer action, and once again some of the best costuming work on television can go a long way in covering up structural flaws. Those are reviews recommending this mess. If this is the standard we hold filmmakers to today, no wonder Netflix's writers view their audiences as moronic consumers. I used to be horrified by how people would claim Season 1 was a faithful adaptation of the books, when really, all it had going for it was Henry Cavill's impression of the games. I have been openly critical of this thing ever since it first aired, and it's why, funnily enough, I don't hate Season 2, Nightmare of the Wolf, or even Blood Origins half as much, because at least those represented the moments the showrunners dropped the facade and just did their own thing. It was the moment everyone stopped acting like this was faithful, that this was in fact Witcher. It was so far off what any of the books stand for that I could completely dissociate it from the source material and laugh at it. And now that I've finally managed to put into words my grievances with all of it, I'm done. Writing this essay has made it clear that the flaws of the show are not mistakes that can be corrected, but an integral part of its design. The quantity over quality approach Netflix have with the brand means they can churn out content faster than I'll ever be able to properly critique it, so I'm done with it all. I refuse to engage with anything Netflix does with the brand going forward, whether it be future seasons, any ill-conceived spin-offs, or behind-the-scenes drama.
Basically saying there is much more to come in Season 2. Please stay tuned.
No. No, I don't think I will.
Trust me, I don't want to be here. I don't enjoy being negative about something I love. If I did, I'd upload more than once every 3 years. No, the reason I took this long to make this essay was that I was foolish enough to give the writers the benefit of the doubt. Even though I despised the show's first season, I waited to see if there was actually some sort of long-term plan, if they could actually turn it all around. But of course they didn't. Season 2 and Blood Origins confirmed everything I feared after Season 1. This is a generic show of prophecies, destinies, and chosen heroes. Even if somehow the writers managed to do the books justice with Seasons 3 and 4, despite having all the wrong setups and backstories for characters, it just means I'm stuck with a show whose first 2 seasons are some of the worst collection of character assassination and Flanderization of ideas I've seen in recent years. This show will never be good. At best, it can become flawed, completely ignoring the first 2 seasons to refocus on the aspects of these stories that should matter, but I doubt it will even achieve that. The first piece of promotion they gave us for Season 3 was a fight scene that never happened in the books. As VFX supervisor Graham Marshall puts it, there's a lot of creative license to stay similar and true to certain parts and enable them to explore different parts as well. I don't think it's anything that anyone's read or seen before in Witcher lore, so I think it's going to be exciting. Even now, They take more pride in what they add to the source material than anything else. So don't make the same mistake I once made and hope what comes next will represent any real change in the writer's philosophy in regards to respecting the tone of the source material, when clearly their approach in the writer's room remains completely unchanged. A part of me will always be sad this is how it went down. This show really could have been something special. While I love the games, I also have my issues with how they handled certain aspects of the world and characters, so seeing a new interpretation of the story was an exciting prospect to me. The source material is stellar, the cast solid, and the budget was there, but the lack of time, care, and consideration given to the show meant that was all meaningless. The folk at the top of the food chain adapted a source material they never believed in. From the start, they felt the need to fix it, that the stories were not captivating enough for audiences without injecting additional action and monsters, that allowing secondary characters naturally become more prominent to the story would be too convoluted for audiences, that it would be too confusing for newcomers without giving everything and everyone origin stories that reinvent everything. In the end, their inability to commit to ideas and themes as they constantly try to please a fanbase they have no understanding of means it will never really improve. All that matters is whether they are hitting the fantasy show bullet points and whether it is successful, as they bend Sapkowski's work to their shallow needs. And it can only go downhill, as the entire basis for this cinematic universe is rotten to its core. This is not television, it's not a work of art brought to life through someone's imagination and talent. It's by Hissrich's own admission, a product.
And then it's what's actually happening here every day, which is all of the little tiny pieces that are coming together, the sets that we're on, the action that we just saw. All of that will come together, but it can't be judged until it's a product.
A vessel for half-baked entertainment. Content for the Netflix machine, designed to satiate the greed of individuals who have no appreciation or respect for the history and legacy of this franchise. Putting it bluntly, this show is a failure, because this isn't a case of something being seemingly unadaptable. We've already seen it successfully brought into visual media with the games. Hell, it's a big part of the reason the show got greenlit in the first place. We have seen what can be done with this franchise when people care. There are excellent fan films that passionately capture the spirit of the books on close to no budget. Witcher 1 was made by a team of guys that had never made a game before, and went fuck it, we'll give it a go. Witcher 2 was entirely made on a budget of $8 million. You know, less than it cost to make one episode of this show. And Witcher 3, one of my favorite games of all time, served as the culmination of all that, bringing in passionate individuals from all over the world to make sure everything from the writing to the art to the composition brought something unique to this niche thing they loved. These all wound up being more emotionally poignant and visually interesting than what Netflix could come up with. You don't need to be a fan. All you need is passion, something Hissrich's team clearly lacks. Ultimately, the show's legacy is what? A few memes and a slew of behind-the-scenes controversies we'll probably never have a straight answer to? When you compare that to the game's lasting impact on the franchise, this show is a footnote, the butt of the joke. Oh, sure, it may not feel like it to Hissrich and her team. They've made a lot of money for themselves. The creation they have spent half a decade of their life on is an all-encompassing disaster, a failure as an original story, a greater failure as an adaptation. The show will be remembered for one thing and one thing only. It's the show that had its lead actor quit because the writing was so poor. Whether or not that is really what happened behind the scenes, we'll probably never know, but in the public's eye, that won't matter. Their show, their writing, and their work will forever be associated with controversy and mediocrity. And so we're clear, the problem was not the source material they were working with. Hissrich forced Witcher to be an ensemble a la Game of Thrones at the expense of structure, characters, and depth in a desperate attempt to copy a more successful show when the franchise was never that to begin with. She never had to do any of that. I have seen Witcher be loved by people who don't care for fantasy. I have seen Witcher rack in awards and be great just by being itself. All it took was respect for the source material, flaws and all. Instead of approaching it with a mentality that asked what must be changed to bring it in line with norms like Hissrich did.
My goal from the very, very beginning of signing on to The Witcher is to bring these amazing books to a bigger audience, to more and more people who are able to discover it in different forms. We know it from the Witcher series already, so let's see if we can also get anime fans in on this.
The games approached it with a mentality of how do we embrace what made this unique.
Actually, we never really thought about it as a monetary value, so like, hey, we signed it for this amount of money, or it was never like a part of our calculation. we had a chance to build a game on something we were totally passionate about, and that was the most important part. So like, obviously, if the price tag would be so high that we wouldn't be able to afford it, we just wouldn't sign it. But it was really totally not a commercial calculation.
It wasn't about bringing the material down to the audience's level, it was about elevating the audience to understand the appeal. All it took was layers upon layers of care to make sure everyone understood the magic of the source material and conveyed that through every single character, location, musical track, and quest. All it took was something more, because that's what Witcher deserves, something more. And that is truly what Netflix failed to understand about this whole thing. It's not enough to make a generic fantasy show with characters called Geralt, Yennefer, and Ciri to make The Witcher. It isn't just about hiring writers that will deliver something banal on time and under budget. It's not enough to meet with Sapkowski in order to claim you respect his work. The Witcher should always transcend that. It deserves purpose, originality, charm, and humanity. It deserves your A game. In fact, I'll go a step further and say any adaptation requires that. Yet with this show, Netflix and the producers delivered nothing but the bare minimum. They boiled down every character and storyline to the archetype they embodied. They poisoned the image of the books by twisting the lessons into cliches, taking advantage of an uninformed audience. If this thing gets people to read the books, that's great, but this show can't even convince its own cast to give them a go.
Valley of Flowers in Polish version was originally named...
What? Valley of Flowers.
Valley of Flowers.
I don't even know what that is. Says that in the script anyway. Don't even know
It's in the books. It's in the books.
I've only read one of them. I've read Blood of Elves.
Laurel Nose in Polish version was originally named a...
I don't even know what any of this stuff is.
Read the books. Read the books.
So really, how much good can this thing be doing? Hissrich kept the themes of the series, but changed the morals. She kept the characters, but changed their motivations. She kept the world, but changed its meaning. Really, what we have here is a case of the ship of Theseus. If you keep the name but change every part of this ship, is it still the same ship? To which my answer would be, it no longer is the same ship if it no longer sails for the same reason. And like I said in the very first part of this series, Netflix's Witcher stopped sailing for the same reason as the books when this happened.
People linked by destiny will always find each other.
Who is Yennefer?
At what point do we stop pretending this is an acceptable translation of the books? Well, when behind-the-scenes drama spews into the public, it would seem. If you enjoy this show for what it is, great. Enjoy what you can. But please don't go around saying it's an even halfway decent, let alone respectful adaptation of the source material, when the bar could have, and has, previously been set so much higher than this. Because personally, I feel completely alienated by the whole thing. Alienated by one side of the fanbase that will insist the changes to the source material were necessary, completely ignoring the way they undermine the themes that made the series unique in the first place. Alienated by another that will call me a nitpicking, gatekeeping idiot for pointing out the very real flaws this show has, even when taken as its own thing. Alienated further by those who claim that Netflix is ruining the series by pushing a so-called woke agenda, completely ignoring the fact that the series has always been deeply political, feminist, and inclusive. And alienated by the ones who don't care for the books and just wanted to see the games brought to the screen, ignoring the fact that that would basically ignore most of what the series has to offer. Split parts of the fanbase all arguing over what Witcher should even be, because a careless team got their hands on it and twisted it into what they wanted it to be. And for all that, for making me feel ashamed of loving this franchise, for making it painfully obvious the world is not a meritocracy, and for revealing the extent to which mass audiences embrace distraction as if that makes for quality entertainment, for all of those things, Netflix can go right ahead and burn.
It seems you're renewed. How disappointing. I've shared all my views. I had a few. Did I not give you a chance? I hoped you'd change my stance. Now I'll burn all the memories of you. All those millions that you waste. All that talent you hired and then replaced. Did you ever even try? As you rushed and you spread your lies, as I burn all the memories of you.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have been the most wonderful of audience. Remember to read the books if you can, and if anyone needs me, I'll be getting drunk.
Why do we yearn? Is the point of no return? After building up the hopes of fence, you gave us something plain. What for do we yearn? Watch the butcher burn. At the end of my days, when I'm through, no word that I written me read quite as true as burn, Netflix, burn, Netflix, burn, 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 burn. Now watch me burn all the memories of you.